Well, hi there! If you haven't already seen the first part of this complete guide to mammals, I would recommend that you start right here. Otherwise, where were we? Oh, that's right. Bats. You've probably seen bats before. There are around 1,400 species of bats. About a quarter of all mammal species are bats. They're very successful. It's frickin' bats. There's just something very beneficial about being able to fly, which probably explains why birds are the most successful reptiles and the only surviving dinosaurs. And insects are the most successful group of animals on the entire planet. In fact, the pterosaurs are the only group of known flighted animals that are not thriving today. So flight has evolved at least 3 different times in vertebrates and once in arthropods. And while the basic concept of powered flight using wings remains constant, the structure of those wings is very different in each one. And it also explains why birds are found all over the globe, including the polar regions, and bats are restricted to warmer regions. Bird wings are actually very small. You know this if you've ever eaten a chicken. The basic tetrapod arm, which are the terrestrial vertebrates, is essentially like your arm. A single bone humerus, 2 bones in the forearm, the radius and ulna, and a bunch of hand bones. We observed this previously when we looked at whales. And you see it in birds, though the hand bones are highly fused. The whole wing is basically a rigid shaft with 4 points of articulation if you include the shoulder. Fewer in hummingbirds. This is the living portion of the wing. But this structure wouldn't function as a wing if it weren't covered in feathers, which are mostly dead, like your hair. Pterosaur wings were more like bat wings, and like your arm. They have a humerus, a radius and ulna, and then a very long hand, especially the metacarpals, which are these bones here, and the ring finger. The word pterodactyl even means wing finger. It makes sense. The majority of the wing is just metacarpals and ring finger. The other 3 fingers stick out of the top of the wing and function like fingers, and they have no pinky finger. The surface area of the wing was not dead like in birds, but was made of living skin like in bats. The bat wing lacks the long metacarpals of the pterosaur wing, but instead of being made of a single finger, it is made up of all 4 fingers, with only the thumb protruding from the top of the wing and still functioning essentially like a normal finger. Again, the surface area comes from living skin and not from dead feathers as in birds. And this means that bats have a huge amount of living surface area. And being homeotherms, animals that maintain a constant body temperature using energy from food, they lose heat very quickly. This is beneficial in warm environments, but devastating in the cold. Hence their limited range as compared to their dead-winged distant cousins, the birds. It also means that they need to eat foods that are high in calories, like nectar, fruit, and other animals, including, at times, people. Bleh. So now I want to fly through the roughly 1,400 bat species and how they're related, because I'm into that kind of thing. Now, I have heard bats referred to as rats with wings many times, but it turns out that the closest relatives to rats that fly are humans. Though flying squirrels are more closely related to rats, it is just that they don't fly, they fall with style. Bats, interestingly enough, are more closely related to whales, sea lions, and pangolins than they are to rats. They're closer to being rhinoceroses with wings. And many of them do have some odd noses and poor vision. At first glance, it would appear that there are fundamentally 2 groups of bats. The little, big-eared echolocating bats, the Microchiroptera, and the big, small-eared visual bats, the Megachiroptera. But more recent studies, including genetic analysis and fossil analysis, tell a different story. Now it appears that the Megachiropteran bats fall right into the middle of the Microchiroptera, making Microchiroptera, without the Megachiroptera, a paraphyletic group. The most distantly related bats to the other bats are not the Megachiroptera, but a different group, the Yangochiroptera, which actually includes the majority of all bat species and families, with the remaining bats falling into the Enterochiroptera. So this is the yin and yang of bats. And today we are going to discover every family of both the yin and the yang. So So let's start with the yin, as it's almost Halloween, so we might as well start out with the sinister bats of the Enterochiroptera. Though I would argue that the most sinister bats, at least as far as we are concerned, are on the yang side of the family tree. So much for our yin and yang dichotomy. Maybe all of the bats are great to discuss right before All Hallows Eve. The Enterochiroptera itself contains 2 large clades. Possibly the least sinister of all bats, unless they're left-handed. I don't know if they favor their left wings. And those would be the megabats of the family Pteropodidae, with the remaining Enterochiropteran families falling into the clade Rhinolophoidea. I told you, the rhinoceroses with wings. But the megabats look more like foxes with wings. Some are even called flying foxes. And in fairness, they're just as related to foxes as they are to rhinoceroses. And these bats do have a very different face from most bats. And they live in a very different way than most bats. Because these bats generally do not use echolocation to navigate, but rather sight and smell. Which means that, like foxes, they have big eyes, long noses, and little ears compared to, well, most other bats. It also means that their mouths and noses look more like those of typical mammal mouths and noses, since they aren't adapted to emitting insane high-frequency sounds, just eating and smelling and the like. They also aren't generally used to grab animals in flight, but rather fruit and nectar, which are considerably easier to catch. The largest of all bats, unsurprisingly, fall into this family, having a wingspan of nearly 6 feet, about 1.7 meters. Though some of the roughly 200 species of megabats are considerably smaller. They are all found in the Old World, especially near the equator, and they are all adorable. As for the Skynoceroses of the clade Rhinolophoidea, there are 6 families, 3 of which, starting with rhino, that fall into 2 clades, each containing 3 families. The least rhino of these 2 clades includes the families Rhinopomatidae, Megadermatidae, and Crassionycteridae, with the Megadermatidae and the Crassionycteridae being most closely related of the 3. The Rhinopomatidae, also called the mouse-tailed bats, even though they're more closely related to rhinos than mice, contains about 6 species. They live in the Old World, mostly North Africa and South Asia, and are frequently observed coming out of crevices in the Egyptian pyramids. No big deal. They have big ears and leaf-shaped noses, and a giant, skinny, hairless Mickey Mouse tail that is not attached to the wing membrane called the patagium. The Megadermatidae, often called the false vampire bats, is another small family containing around 6 species of big-eared, leaf-nosed bats, but this time with no tails at all, which is actually something they have in common with most of the megabats. They are also rather large for non-megabats. Found in Africa, Asia, and Australia, most are brown, but some are white, bluish, or even green. The family Crassionycteridae is composed of only 1 species, the bumblebee bat. This is the smallest of the 1,400 bat species and is in contention for being the smallest of all mammals. And it is remarkably small, especially considering that small animals have a relatively huge amount of surface area compared to their volume, and thus lose heat very rapidly. It isn't easy to be a tiny mammal, even without skin wings. But these guys are only a bit over an inch long, and that's pretty darn tiny. Also called the Kitti's hog-nosed bat due to their slightly upturned nose and possibly the fact that they're more closely related to both hogs and kitties than they are to rats or bumblebees. They're found in limestone caves in Myanmar and Thailand. The most rhino of the 2 Rhinolophoidea clades includes the families Rhinonycteridae, Hipposideridae, and Rhinolophidae. Of these 3, the least closely related would be the 9 species of trident bats of the family Rhinonycteridae. They are called trident bats because their nose leaves often have a trident shape at the top. They are found mostly in Australia, Africa, and Madagascar. The more than 70 species of bats in the family Hipposideridae, because they're more closely related to hippos than rats, are also often called the Old World leaf-nosed bats. That's a funny common name since other than the megabats, every group we have discussed so far has been Old World leaf-nosed bats. Well, these Old World leaf-nosed bats also live in the Old World, and they have a more rounded leaf nose. Their closest living relatives are the more than 100 species of horseshoe bats of the family Rhinolophidae, which are more closely related to both horses and rhinos than they are to rats. This is another Old World leaf-nosed bat that can be distinguished from their closest relatives, the Old World leaf-nosed bats, by their nose leaves, which are shaped like horseshoes instead of rounded leaves. And these guys may have had a role in some of the SARS-related coronavirus outbreaks that you may have heard about. And while we're on the subject of leaf noses, let's talk about leaf noses. What the heck is with those leaf noses? Well, as you probably know, many bats use echolocation to navigate. They bounce sound off of objects and then gain a mental picture of their surroundings based on how that sound bounces back, hence the big ears. This means that you need to channel that sound in a predictable manner so that you can make sense of the echoes. And you can make that sound using either your mouth or your nose. It's generally pretty easy to tell how a bat makes that sound by looking at its nose. If it has small ears, like a flying fox, it probably doesn't echolocate. But if it has big ears and a normal nose, it's probably a mouth screamer. If it has big ears and a crazy nose, it's probably a schnoz trumpeter. So far, all we have discussed are megabats and nasal shriekers, and all from the Old World. So let's shine a little light on the largest clade of bats, and the only clade found here in the Americas, the Yangochiroptera. Now, the majority of the bats fall into this clade, and I honestly can't find two phylogenies that tell the same story. So take a lot of these relationships with a grain of salt. In fact, it's a total mess as far as I can tell. So this might be a great place to build a PhD project, if you're into that kind of thing. But in general, there seem to be three main clades, and I'm not going to declare which two of the three are most closely related. I'm going to leave it a polytomy, and I'll let you tell me during your dissertation defense. And I'm going to leave the relationships within these clades as polytomies as well. I'm really looking forward to reading your papers. But I definitely want to talk about each of these families because there are some really weird bats in here. So let's just start with the smallest of the three clades, the Emballoneuroidea, and I'll work my way to the biggest. The Emballoneuroidea contains just two families, the Emballonuridae and the Nycteridae. The Emballonuridae, comprised of a little over 50 species, are also known as the sack-winged or sheath-tailed bats, which are some pretty odd common names, but they make sense when you know something about these bats. The sac wings refer to small, sac-shaped glands on their wings that release chemical signals called pheromones to attract mates, much like moths. Now, moths pick up on pheromones using their feathery antennae. Bats don't have antennae. They smell with their noses. And the sac-winged bats have longer noses than most bats that aren't megabats. Additionally, there is no nose leaf, but they have big ears, so you can probably guess that this is a buccal blaster. As for the sheath tails, the wing membrane, the uropatagium, of sheath-tailed bats extends most of the way up the tail, but the end of the tail extends outside of it. Most tailed bats either have their tail entirely attached to the uropatagium or not at all. If it is attached, then the wing membrane is bigger and can be modified by the legs and tail, which is good for flight. But it is difficult to use the legs for locomotion. If the tail is free, the opposite is true. Well, the tail on the sheath-tailed bats is not connected directly to the tail, but rather the tail sits in a sheath, and the uropatagium can be moved by the legs to include more or less of the tail, essentially giving them the option of having a free tail or not, depending on the application. These tiny bats are found in tropical and subtropical parts of basically every continent with such regions. Their closest relatives, and this is the last time I will be saying that today since all of the other clades are going to be polytomies that you're going to sort out, but their closest relatives are the roughly 15 species of the family Nycteridae, the slit-faced or hollow-faced bats. These bats are a bit larger than their cousins and have a distinctive concavity, almost like a pit or a canyon in the middle of their face. But it can be difficult to see because of their fur. I'm sure they didn't notice it because they have absolutely dinky eyes. They look like river dolphin eyes. And like river dolphins, these guys are highly, highly reliant on echolocation to find food. And you can tell that just by looking at those enormous ears. They're huge. Not only do they have big ears for echolocating, but these bats will also just sit on a perch and listen. And their nose has nasal shrieking written all over it, though they use relatively quiet calls to echolocate, probably because with ears like that, you don't need to be very loud. Their tail is totally webbed into the uropatagium, which aids the short, broad wings to have a lot of surface area so that these bats can hover when hunting. These bats are found in and around the tropical regions of Africa, and I doubt you will confuse them with anything else in the area. The second smallest clade in the Yangocheiroptera are the Vespertilionoidea, which contains the families Miniopteridae, Cistugidae, Molosidae, Natalidae, and Vespertilionidae. So let's start with the family Miniopteridae, the long-winged or bent-winged bats. Now, all bats have bent wings. There are no hummingbird bats, but I reckon that you can guess why they're called long-winged bats. Or at least you can get close. Their wings are actually not all that long, but their bodies are disproportionately tiny. So their individual wings are more than twice the length of their head and body combined. So they might be called mini because of their mini bodies. They have the nose morphology of a buccal shouter, so they look nothing like the leaf-nosed bats. And their big ears and short faces will tell you that they aren't megabats. But to tell them apart from other oral howlers, their tails are included in the wing webbing, though we have seen that before. What is really unique is their long wings and that they lack the locking tendon in their feet to lock them in a hanging position. So I doubt that these bats will ever be found hanging when at rest. I have only ever seen them sprawled out on all fours like a pterosaur. And I know that the adaptations to this form of locomotion account for the name bent-winged bats. Because like I said, all bats have bent wings. The roughly 40 species of these little pterosaur bats are found in the Old World only. Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and lots of islands in the vicinity. The family Cistugidae includes only 2 species, the hairy bats or gland-winged bats from Africa. Now, all bats are hairy, so I don't really get that. In most ways, this is a fairly typical looking little bat. Big ears, no nose leaf, and that tells you something about if and how it screams at the world. Its tail is entirely webbed into the uropatagium, but it has 2 to 3 soft glands in its wings near the forearm that really distinguish these bats from any others. So if you catch a bat like this in Africa and it has those wing glands, you probably know what you have. The family Molosidae is the second largest family in the Vespertilionoidea and the 4th largest family of all bat families with over 125 species. Now these are often called the free-tailed bats, as nobody tells their tails what to do, or because they're almost completely free of the uropatagium. Though they do have a ring of cartilage that can slide the uropatagium down the tail using muscles during flight, giving them massive control over their wing surface. This helps to make them the fastest, highest flying, and among the most maneuverable of all bats, and probably contributes to their near global distribution. They honestly look a lot like sheath-tailed bats, but without the wing glands. The 12 species in the family Natalidae are about the weirdest looking bats I have ever seen. Also called funnel-eared bats because of their big funnel ears. I would call them ears and mouth bats, or where the heck are your eyes and nose bats? For the record, they have really long tails, which are completely webbed into the uropatagium. But mostly, if you're in the New World and you find a bat with big ears, a big mouth, and you really aren't sure if it has eyes or a nose, well, you know what you have. But the largest family in the Vespertilionoidea, and the largest of all bat families with nearly 500 species, is the family Vespertilonidae. For the record, nearly 10% of all described mammal species are Vespertilonid bats. Also known as Vesper or simple-nosed bats, they have a fairly stereotypical face with large ears and a nose and eyes that you can actually see, but no nose leaf. So, you know they're teeth talkers. Vesper meaning evening, which is pretty normal for bats. Of course, in a lot of ways, this is the standard bat. They are found all over the world. Pretty much anywhere that is warm enough to have bats has vespertilionid bats. Sorry, Antarctica. And that brings us to the last bat clade that we have to discuss today, the 7 families of the Noctilinoidea. And let's start with the family for which the whole clade was named, the Noctilionidae. The Noctilionidae, also known as bulldog bats or fishing bats, includes only 2 species, the greater and lesser bulldog bats. These are orange to brown bats with large, strong feet for grabbing prey and faces that look like jowly dogs, hence the name. And for the record, they are more closely related to bulldogs than they are to rats. If you're in Central or South America and you catch a bat that isn't a free-tailed bat and has the face of a bulldog, bingo is his name-o. Next are the 5 species of disc-winged bats of the family Thyropteridae. These Central and South American bats can be identified by the presence of a disc-shaped suction cup on the bottom of each thumb and on their feet that allows them to cling to leaves while roosting. These little suckers usually hang out, head up, inside of curled young leaves during the day. They have faces that look like big-eared, small-eyed hedgehogs. No nose leaf. But those suction cups should be enough to tell you what you have. The family Reptiles is another 2-species family that includes the smoky bat and the thumbless bat. These Central and South American bats basically look like a brown, furry egg with wings, big, broad ears, and an eyeball at the base of each ear, like the ear funnels light into the eye or something. But their most diagnostic feature is that their thumbs do not protrude out of the wing, and they may be absent altogether, hence the name. The roughly 18 species of ghost-faced, naked-backed, and mustached bats of the family Mormoopidae look basically like Ferengis, but with crazy leaf lips, fur, and wings. And just to be clear, that is not a nose leaf. These are leaf lips. They're crazy looking and found in North, Central, and South America. The largest family in the Noctilinoidea, the second largest and most ecologically diverse of all bat families, is the family Phylostomidae. I would also argue that this family contains the most sinister of all bats, at least as far as we're concerned. These are the over 200 species of New World leaf-nosed bats. If you're in the Americas and you find a snot rocket chowder, you know what you have. Now, most are insectivores, but some eat fruit, like New World megabats. The spectral bat, the largest bat in the Americas, eats pretty good-sized birds that it catches in flight. Lots of them eat a wide diversity of smaller vertebrates. And one of them eats people. Okay, it probably doesn't eat people very often, but they drink vertebrate blood, and you are a vertebrate with blood for now. In addition to being a leaf-nosed bat in the New World, they also lack a tail. They really shouldn't be difficult to identify. And that gets us to our final 2 bat families. Thank you for sticking with me. If you've made it this far, you should join us over on Patreon for more bat content, because you're clearly into this kind of thing. But let's get to those final 2. Now, the family Mysopodidae is probably the family of bats that we've covered that you are the least likely to have ever seen before. There are only 2 species in this family, and they are the only family of bats endemic to the island of Madagascar. These are the sucker-footed bats. I bet you can guess what these bats have. But in case you can't, these little suckers have suckers on their wrists and ankles. These are very similar to the suckers on the disc-winged bats of the Americas, but they work a bit differently, and they're in Madagascar. So if you're looking at a bat with suckers and you're not sure which one it is, ask yourself if you saw a chameleon or a lemur today as well. Now, the suckers on these little Malagasy suckers are not so much suckers as they are sticky pads. These bats use a form of sweating through their pads to generate wet adhesion, like a tree frog, and not suction like a disc-winged bat. But, like disc-winged bats, sucker-footed bats also sleep, head up, inside of rolled-up leaves during the day. And because those leaves are difficult for arthropods to climb, they rarely have parasites like most other bats. And that brings us to the final family of bats, the Mystacinidae. And if there is a family of bats that you're less likely to have seen than the sucker-footed bats, then it would be these, the New Zealand short-tailed bats. And New Zealand, a place I have been blessed to visit and to which I would like to return in the future, has some of the weirdest biodiversity on Earth. For one thing, when humans first arrived in New Zealand, the only mammals on the island were bats. And these bats live only in New Zealand. New Zealand has a lot of birds that spend an inordinate amount of time on the ground. Many, like kiwis, fill ecological niches filled by terrestrial mammals, usually. And these little bats decided to get in on the New Zealand ground game as well. Though they can fly, they spend a considerable amount of time on the ground eating about all of the things that you would eat if you were stuck on an island looking for food. They eat insects, fruit, pollen, carrion, and nectar. Historically, there were two species, though one may have gone extinct in the 1960s. They have some unique ground bat adaptations, such as leathery sheaths for their wings and special claws for digging and climbing. And a 2010 study showed that a single feral cat killed 100 of these bats in a single week. So if you haven't seen our video on cats, please keep your cats indoors. So bats account for about a quarter of all described mammals, and rodents for more than 40%. In fact, we have discussed the 4 most speciose mammal groups already. But the family next most distantly related to the rest of the Lorasiatheria, the family Manatees, is not so successful, with only 8 or 9 species, all of which threatened by overhunting. Which is a terrible shame because pangolins are so darn wonderful. There are 3 total genera, with 1 in Asia and 2 in Africa. And you're unlikely to mix them up with really anything else. They feed largely on eusocial insects and are sometimes called scaly anteaters. And though there are many diverse types of ant-eating mammals, these do not look at all like any of the others. Mostly because they're covered in huge keratinous scale-like armor plates. They look a bit like armadillos, which we'll cover soon, but armadillos, despite being armored mammals, really don't look much like pangolins at all. Armadillos tend to have a shell-like armor with bands, not scales all over. And most armadillos have large ear pinnae, which are conspicuously absent in pangolins. Plus, they're on the wrong continents. But even if they weren't, pangolins look more like armadillo lizards than they do like actual armadillos. Not only are the scales of pangolins tough, but they're also sharp. When threatened, they roll up into a ball with their head protected under their giant tail, and they also can emit a skunk-like spray to really add to the efficacy of their defense. Being a slow, toothless animal that ranges in size from about 3.5 kilos to around 35 kilos depending on species, so around 8 to almost 80 pounds, they're not tiny, but they lack any remarkable size or weapons. And they live in the presence of lions, tigers, and bears. So it makes sense that they have some pretty spectacular defenses. For a long time, we thought that pangolins were closely related to armadillos, but genetic and fossil evidence has revealed that this does not seem to be the case. In fact, it now appears that pangolins are more closely related to whales than they are to armadillos or anything else that we've discussed today. Their closest relatives are the 2 remaining clades in the Lorasiatheria, the carnivorans and the eungulates. And I don't know which one we should discuss first. They're both such rad groups. But since we just said that pangolins are closely related to whales, I think we'll start with that clade. Because whales, as it turns out, are ungulates. Part of one of the most diverse and unusual clades of extant mammals, the clade Eungulata, the true ungulates. This distinction was made to differentiate them from several Afrotherian groups that have, in the past, been classified as ungulates as well. And there is still some debate today as to whether or not the true ungulates are even one another's closest relatives. But if so, it would mean that the largest land mammal ever known to have existed, as well as the largest mammal the world has ever seen, were both part of this amazing clade. Not too shabby. So our current understanding of the phylogenetic position of the true ungulates is that they are most closely related to the carnivora. So giraffes, for example, are more closely related to lions and tigers and bears than they are to elephants. Heck, they're more closely related to bats than they are to elephants. So I think you can see why the Afrotherians are no longer considered to be ungulates. Because if giraffes and elephants were both ungulates, then you would be too. Because you are more closely related to a giraffe than a giraffe is to an elephant. The reality is that the only mammals less closely related to giraffes than are elephants are the monotremes and the marsupials. But right now, I want to dig into the Eungulata, what they are and how they're related. In general, Eungulates are hooved eutherian mammals that walk mostly or entirely on the tips of their toes, unguligrade. Many also with head-mounted weapons like horns, antlers, or ossicones. A hoof consists of a hard rubbery sole where the continuously growing nail wraps around the tip of the toe, forming a hard wall. And we'll dig into the different types of head weaponry when we get to them. There are more. Lots more. This group excels in noggin spikes. Probably the best head weaponry since the ceratopsians went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. About the same time that the first recognizable Eungulates seem to have come onto the scene, which was in North America, so it is possible that a Eungulate has come face to face with a Triceratops at some point. Today, the Eungulates are divided into two main clades that can be identified primarily by the number of hooved tippy toes on which they stand, if they stand at all. Some can't stand. And it's not so much a matter of the exact number as it is whether or not that number is even or odd. For example, a modern horse stands on one toe, odd. A cow stands on two, even. The odd-toed ungulates fall into the clade Perissodactyla, which literally means odd toes. And the even-toed ungulates into the clade Artiodactyla, which means even toes. This is how scientific naming is supposed to work, by the way. Today, there are only about 17 species of odd-toed ungulates alive in 3 families. We could very reasonably make a video covering all 17 species of them at some point in the future, so let me know if you're into that kind of thing. The oldest evidence of this group comes from the very beginning of the Cenozoic in both North America and Asia. Though since all of the North American perissodactyls appear to have gone extinct about 10,000 years ago, native species are today only found in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. Of the 17 species, 7 of them fall into the family Equidae, the horse family, which includes not only horses, but asses and zebras, as well as a host of extinct groups. And though we tend to think of horses as being introduced to the Americas by the Spaniards, they actually first evolved in the Americas, and were here for about 54 million years, only becoming extinct on the continent very recently. Though the earliest equids were small, like the size of a fox, with 4 toes on each front foot and 3 on the back, today's equids are larger, with only a single toe. They are the only single-toed ungulates, so that alone will differentiate them from anything else in the group. And while we're on the subject of horse toes, I want to talk for just a moment about that unguligrade stance. Horses are pretty notorious for having knees and elbows that bend backward. The thing is that I know of no vertebrates that have knees or elbows that bend backwards. In fact, horse limbs bend in the exact same way as your limbs. It is just that most people have no idea which joints they're looking at when they look at a horse, and this has a lot to do with the fact that they are not just standing on their toes like a carnivoran, but on the tips of their toes, making their legs extra confusing. So let's start at the shoulder of a horse. That joint is pretty normal. It's just that it's much higher on the body than most people realize. And that's because it has musculature and skin that hold it somewhat in place, and the legs can swing forward right at the bottom of the chest. And many people therefore think that this is the shoulder. But it isn't. That's their elbow. The shoulder is more at the front of the chest, and the humerus, this comical bone here, is actually relatively short. So that is the elbow. This joint here that most people think is their backwards elbow is actually their wrist. But one of the main reasons that it doesn't look like a wrist, other than the fact that you didn't know where their elbow was, is because there is another joint after that. Of course, you have one of those too. And you find something very similar on the hind legs. The hip joint is up on the body and almost unnoticeable, again attached by musculature and skin. The first joint that you likely see is the knee. But since it's all the way up, almost right against the body, it seems like it must be the hip. What looks like a backwards knee is the ankle, and the last joint is the hinge between the elongated foot bones and the toe. And we're going to see this basic pattern across the Eungulata, though in all cases with more toes. which makes it a little easier to tell where the foot stops and the toes begin. The 10 remaining species in the Perissodactyla fall into two families that are both more closely related to one another than they are to the equids, with both families having 4 or 5 species. Those two families are the family Tapiridae, the tapirs, and the Rhinocerotidae, the rhinoceroses, both of which are simply special creatures. And the delightful thing about modern Perissodactyls is that, heck, what are you going to confuse with them? And even given that the basic form of a tapir and a rhino are very similar, I mean, are you going to confuse them with one another? Tapirs seem to have appeared in Europe, though today they only remain in South and Central America and Asia. While they aren't even the largest trunked animals in Asia, they are the largest native land animals in South and Central America today, with some getting as large as about 300 kilos, or around 660 pounds. All tapirs have oval-shaped ears with white tips, J-Lo-style hindquarters with short tails, 4 front toes and 3 in the rear, like ancient horses, and trunks on their faces. And it's pretty crazy how similar the tapirs are to one another, considering that their chromosomal numbers range from 52 to 80, 26 pairs to 40 pairs. The fact that they have a trunk makes it very unlikely that you will confuse them with anything else alive today. And it also means that they have some crazy looking skulls. And while nasal appendages are not the only way to distinguish them from their closest extant cousins, should get the job done. Not many people find it difficult to identify a rhinoceros, though some of their closest relatives, including the largest land mammal perhaps ever, might throw some people for a loop. I mean, if you can imagine a long-necked hornless rhino, taller than a giraffe and weighing 2 to 3 times as much as an elephant, well, that would be Paraceratherium, the closest known relative of the rhinoceratids. But rhinoceratids are much smaller, today rarely getting over 2,300 kilograms, which is just a tad over a dainty 5,100 pounds, which still makes them the largest land ungulates alive today, but smaller than all 3 species of elephants, and way, way smaller than some of the sea ungulates. Their basic body shape is similar to that of a tapir. And being found in Asia, as well as Africa, I guess you could be somewhere where you would need to be able to tell the difference. But their ears are pointier, they have less hair, 3 toes on their front feet as well as the hind feet, and don't have much junk in their trunks, or trunks at all for that matter. Oh, and they have horns on their faces. At least modern rhinos. Though horn might not be the right word for it, as horns generally have a bony core surrounded by a keratin sheath. In rhinos, the entire horn is made of keratin. It's like a big fingernail stuck on their noses. Anyway, I'm looking forward to taking a deep dive into every species of this rad clade. But we have a much larger and somewhat more confusing and bizarre clade left to discuss. By larger, I mean way larger. Like more than 20 times larger. Around 350 species. We're probably not going to make a video covering every single species in the Artiodactyla anytime soon. Native even-toed ungulates are today found on every continent except for Antarctica and Australia, and are found in all of the world's oceans. They're even likely responsible for driving the largest false penguin of all time into extinction. The oldest fossil evidence of them is over 50 million years old, but we find such fossils in North America, Europe, and Asia, so it's hard to say where the group originated. It was pretty easy to get from North America to Europe to Asia at that time, so it isn't really strange that they would end up in all 3 of those places pretty quickly. As we discussed earlier, the even-toed ungulates put their weight on an even number of toes, at least if they support their weight on their toes at all. 2 toes to be precise, with hooves. Again, if they support their weight at all. Most of them are also herbivorous, as we saw in the odd-toed ungulates. And plant cellulose is actually rather difficult to digest fully, and requires the assistance of many symbiotic microbes. Odd-toed ungulates, like most mammalian herbivores, digest cellulose with the aid of microbes in their intestines. They are called hindgut fermenters. But most herbivorous even-toed ungulates do it in 1 or more stomach chambers. They are called foregut fermenters. And of the even-toed foregut fermenters, the family most distantly related to the rest are these. The 7 species of camels, llamas, alpacas, vicuñas, and guanacos in the family Camelidae. Which are weird for a number of reasons, but let's start with the fact that they don't have hooves. They have 2 weight-bearing toes, but just toenails, like an ostrich. Their limbs are also attached at the hip, but without the skin and muscle attachments going all the way to the knee that we find in most of the ungulates, making it a lot easier to see all of the parts of their legs. They also have crazy teeth with not only canines, but incisor teeth and premolars that all look like canines. So they look like they have a bunch of canine teeth. And they have a split upper lip where each side can be controlled and moved independently. Camelids first appeared in North America and made it to every continent except Australia and Antarctica. They were driven to extinction in North America in the very recent past, and likely by humans, but introduced to Australia by humans, so I guess we're calling it a wash. Like giraffes that we will discuss later, camelids move both legs on each side at the same time, giving them a very unique gait. And if you think that modern camelids look a little like giraffes, wait until you find out about Apicamelus, which essentially was a North American giraffe, except it was a camelid. I would love to do a camelid video just so we can dig into that and discuss the fact that they have fat, not water, in their humps, and why that's way better than having water. But now that we're over the hump, I think we can discuss the next most basal group of extant even-toed ungulates, the two families of pigs and peccaries in the clade Swina. And I'm grateful to have made this video because I didn't know that peccaries were not pigs before I started researching this group. They are the hagfish of pigs. Pigs are the 18 or 19 species in the family Suidae, which does include warthogs. Sorry, Pumbaa.
Hey, who's the pig? Are you talking to me? Uh-oh, they called him a pig. Are you talking to me? Shouldn't have done that. Are you talking to me? Now they're in for it. They call me Mr. Pig! Ah!
Also boars, hogs, bush pigs, and the ever so crazy looking babirussas. Originating from Asia, native species are found today in Africa, Asia, and Europe. They can be distinguished from most other even-toed ungulates as they have 4 hooves on each foot, though they place their weight primarily on 2, like everyone else that places weight. And pigs do not have the complex stomach of foregut fermenters. They are hindgut fermenters. They have big heads, small eyes, and large ears, with a very distinctive round or oval-shaped nose. They're round-bodied like tapirs and rhinos with short tails and a phallus shaped like that of a duck. If you know, you know. Here's a video you can't unsee. Their canines are modified into tusks, which are sometimes quite extreme. Sometimes they end up growing back into the brain case, causing death. I call that extreme. And they have upper incisors, which is something that we will not see in many other even-toed ungulates. I could see making a video about all of the pigs. The question is, would it also include the other family in the Swina, the family Teaswidae, the 3 or 4 species of peccaries found in the Americas, which are very social creatures that live in groups called a squadron. I could not love that more. Originating in North America, they have since colonized both American continents. But given that invasive pigs are now common in many parts of the peccary range, it is beneficial to be able to distinguish between them. And in most ways, they do look very similar. They have a similar shape with large heads and small eyes, though the ears of peccaries are less pointed and generally smaller than those of pigs. Pig tails are tasseled at the end, where peccary tails are smaller and relatively untasseled. Peccaries, unlike pigs, may have only 2 total toes, so they don't have 4 conspicuous hooves on each foot like pigs. Their tusks also look more like giant canine teeth than they do like tusks. They also have a multi-chambered stomach and have independently evolved foregut fermentation, unlike their cousins the pigs, which again have simple stomachs and are hindgut fermenters. Peccaries are also, as a group, smaller than pigs, which can get as large as 275 kilos, a touch over 600 pounds. Peccaries max out at more like 40 kilos, which is less than 90 pounds. And that brings us to the 2 largest clades of ungulates, the approximately 200 species of ruminants in the clade Ruminantia, and the 90 or so species in the delightfully named clade Hippomorpha. Hippomorpha because it includes hippos, but why the because it contains whales. That's why. But I'll start with the ruminants because I've mostly made this video because I wanted to talk about pronghorns. And this clade is all kinds of full of foregut fermenters with rad head weapons. One of my favorite moments of my childhood was spending a half an hour or so watching a tiny little antelope called a Kirk's dik-dik chew its cud. Something that is very common among foregut fermenters. Heck, the word ruminant means to chew again. A little extra chewing never hurt anyone. I mean, just ask rabbits. They're not even foregut fermenters. Awkward. But the good thing about ruminants is that they don't pass their plant matter all the way through their digestive systems before bringing it back around for a little bonus chewing. And ruminants are not the first foregut fermenters that we've discussed, but they are the only ones with a 4-chambered stomach. Camelids, for example, only have 3 chambers. So these are 4-chambered foregut fermenters with often fun, sometimes forked fighting implements fused to their faces and foreheads. However, the basalmost family of 4-chambered foregut fermenters fails to fashion any form of forehead fighting implements or even formidable size. And that would be the 10 species of mouse deer in the family Tragulidae. Tragulidae means tiny goat. Now in reality, mouse deer aren't mice, deer, or goats, but they are the smallest hoofed animals on the planet, so they are pretty tiny. The largest species only gets to be about 16 kilos. That's about 35 pounds. Small for the biggest one, but not that small. But some are only about 1 kilo, like 2 pounds. That's a very small ungulate. And while they don't have any horns, antlers, or other forehead fighting implements, they do have some tremendous and terrifying teeth, earning them the name fanged deer. These giant canine teeth are particularly prominent in males and are used in combat. So this is a saber-tooth, not deer or goat. Not the only one, but one of them. Most of them are found in Asia and feed entirely on plants. But the largest species, found in Africa, is highly aquatic and feeds not only on plants, but also on things like insects and crabs. Fanged false deer appear to be the most similar in basic body plan to the common ancestor of all ruminants, which means that they are probably the most similar to the ancestors that were shared with the Whippomorpha. And suddenly, the idea that the ancestors of hippos and whales might have been little hooved ungulates seems to make a lot more sense. But the closest relatives to the fanged false deer are the rest of the Ruminantia, the 5 families in the clade Picora, the horn bearers, though only one family actually has true horns. Most of them do have some sort of interoral noggin spikes. The noggin spikers fall into 2 clades, and I'm going to start with the clade that contains the true horns, because that will help us make more sense of the non-horns when we get to them. So the clade of horn bearers with true horns contains 3 families. The basalmost family, the true deer of the family Cervidae, doesn't have any true horns, but we'll get to them in a second. The other 2 families are the Bovidae and the Muscidae, and it is the bovids that have true horns. Muscids don't have any weapons protruding from their frontal bones. But don't worry, they aren't unarmed. More saber-toothed teeth are coming. But I want to start with the bovids and work our way to the pronghorns. Bovids are a diverse clade containing over 140 species, the majority of all ungulates, which is at least part of why I often feel like I struggle with this group. But they come in a variety of unique forms, from monsters like buffalo and bison, to agile gazelles, to torpedo-shaped dikers, and pretty much everything in between. I think a video just about them would be wonderful. If you're wondering if we're running out of groups to discuss, the answer is no. Bovids came out of Africa and Eurasia about 20 million years ago. Most species are still found in Africa, though they are also present in Asia and Europe and North America. The most distinctive thing about bovids is that all males and many females possess horns. The easiest way to identify a horn at a glance is that it's an unbranching, hard, pointed structure growing out of the frontal bone of the animal. Just this is enough to distinguish them from antlers, ossicones, or pronghorns. What you might not see at a glance is that the horn is a keratin sheath over a live bony core, neither of which are ever shed. And this alone will distinguish them from their closest relatives, the 7 species of musk deer, which aren't deer, of the family Muscidae. Musk deer have no horns at all, but they do have head weapons, some spectacular saber teeth. Unlike their 2 closest relatives, musk deer do not have a scent gland right in front of their eyes, called a preorbital gland. But instead, males have a musk gland located on the venter just below the belly button. This lack of a preorbital gland, as well as knowing that they are found mostly in high-altitude locations in Asia, can assist in distinguishing them from water deer, which look very similar but are actual deer. So let's talk about the 55 species of true deer, including elk, moose, muntjacs, caribou, and reindeer of the family Cervidae. They do have preorbital glands, just like bovids. But in general, it is easy to distinguish them from bovids because males, and some females, possess antlers instead of horns. At a glance, antlers can be identified quickly by the fact that they generally branch, something that horns never do. though they aren't the only branching ruminant head weapons. So in addition to branching, it is good to know that antlers are primarily made of dead bone, with no keratin sheath, just skin like velvet that is shed once the antlers are fully grown annually. Antlers are generally grown every year and shed following the breeding season, something that never happens in bovids. Deer are natively found on every continent except for Antarctica and Australia, though there is just one species in Africa, the realm of the bovids. And they are another group that we really need to explore in greater detail sometime soon. I mean, moose get to be 2.6 meters tall. That's 8.5 feet and weigh up to 800 kilograms, around 1,800 pounds. I just don't think that moose get enough love. But now I want to make our way over to the other clade of living horn bearers, because these two families are pure joy. I mean, one of them are the Giraffidae of Africa, which, as we discussed in our Lego reaction video, have disproportionately short necks, though very long necks. Of the 2 to 9 species, depending on who you talk to, the only one without a crazy long neck is the okapi, which is definitely one of my favorite creatures. Giraffids not only have long necks, super long legs, and short bodies, but long, purplish, prehensile tongues that they use to strip leaves from trees. You know a giraffe when you see one. But the most unique feature of giraffes are their ossicones. Ossicones are the crazy head weapons on top of all male giraffids, and most females as well. They're similar to horns in that they're in roughly the same location, don't branch, and have a live bone core. Interestingly, as they grow, that core is cartilage, and it doesn't actually fuse to the skull until after the giraffe reaches maturity, and it might need to start bashing the heck out of its neighbors with them. Are we going to make a whole video about giraffes just so we can talk about this absurd combat? Yes, we are. For sure we are. But the most obvious thing that differentiates ossicones from horns is that the outer sheath is made of skin instead of keratin. And that gets us to their closest relatives, the inappropriately named pronghorn antelope of the family Antilocapridae, which aren't antelopes, though they are the fastest land ungulates on the planet, and the fastest running animals, period, over long distances. There is one carnivoran that is faster over short distances. They look, at a glance, like antelope, but being in North America, you shouldn't confuse the two. There are no antelopes in the Western Hemisphere. But you could also look at the fact that they only have 2 toes, where all bovids have 4. This will help you distinguish them from cervids, but not giraffids. Add to that they essentially have ossicones, a live bone core covered in skin. Outside of the breeding season, it really looks like an ossicone. Unlike ossicones, but like horns, it develops a keratinous sheath during the breeding season. Unlike horns, it's forked and shed annually, and has skin under it on top of the bone core. Pronghorns are wild structures, and there is only one species left on Earth that has them. I feel very blessed that I get to see these rad little giraffe cousins with some regularity here in Utah. But that brings us to the last clade of ungulates, the delightfully named Whippomorpha, which includes, of course, the 2 species of hippopotamuses in the family Hippopotamidae, and the roughly 94 species of whales in the clade Cetacea. Hippos, possessing 4 toes and 3-chambered stomachs, are pretty clearly non-ruminant artiodactyls, but just where they belong has long been a subject of debate. However, today, it seems pretty clear that they are sister to the whales. And if you had to pick a closest ungulate relative to whales, is this not what you would think it would be? Though they once had a larger range expanding into Eurasia, today they are found native only in Africa, though they are introduced into South America. What a thing to introduce. They are unguligrade, but like camels, they do not have hooves, just toenails. They're somewhat pig-like in shape, with large mouths and terrifying canines and incisors. And they would be the second largest of all ungulates at around 1,500 kilos or 3,300 pounds if it weren't for their closest relatives, the whales. Of the infraorder Cetacea are some of the most well-known and beloved animals on the planet. So I was very surprised a few years back when I discovered this. A 13-meter, 15-ton whale with the face of a dolphin. What the heck was this thing? And how could I have gone my whole life as an animal fanatic with multiple degrees in biology and zoology without noticing that these colossal stretch dolphins existed? What are they? And what other whales are out there that somehow had snuck under my radar? Well, today I'm going to find out, because today we are going to examine all of the whales, how they're related to one another, and what makes each family unique. And we're going to figure out exactly what this thing is. But to start, we should probably discuss what whales are and how they fit in with the rest of life on Earth. Whales are marine mammals. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't fish. A solid argument can be made that you are a fish. And you, after all, are more closely related to trout than trout are to sharks. So if trout and sharks are both fish, then so are you. And whales. But the reality is that the closest relatives of whales are other mammals, not fish like trout or sharks. Mammals are homeothermic vertebrates with hair and mammary glands. They produce milk. That is actually the defining characteristic of mammals. Whales specifically are placental or eutherian mammals. And since mammals evolved on land from other land-dwelling amniotes, it stands to reason that the ancestors of whales lived on land as well. Of course, just because it makes sense that their ancestors would have lived on land doesn't make it so. So what evidence is there that this is so? Well, for one thing, genetic and morphological analyses suggest that cetaceans are the closest living relatives to the hippopotamuses, which spend at least some time on land and are part of the order Artiodactyla, the even-toed ungulates like pigs, camels, antelope, deer, and cattle. Hence their multi-chambered stomachs. Now, most aquatic and marine fish swim with a side-to-side motion and have tail fins oriented up and down accordingly. This side-to-side bending continued on even as fish moved onto land. You see this very clearly today in amphibians and reptiles. Their limbs are held out to the side, sprawling, because that is the most conducive to movement when your spine moves side to side like a fish. But it does have a couple of downsides. First, it is mechanically easier to hold yourself off of the ground with your legs directly under you. This is especially true as organisms become very large. And second, if you have paired lungs, when you bend sideways, you compress one lung, pushing air out of it, and expand the other lung, pulling air in. In essence, as you run, bending side to side, air moves from one lung to the other, but it is very difficult to breathe while running. In groups like mammals and dinosaurs, these problems were alleviated by holding the legs under their bodies, erect. Of course, when your limbs are directly beneath you, bending your spine side to side does not help much with running. And so what you see in mammals, like cheetahs, is that running speed is increased dramatically by flexing the spine up and down and not side to side. And when mammals returned to the water, they retained that up and down vertebral flexibility that evolved on land. Or at least it would stand to reason that this is why whales still move like this today. But whales are very different from most other mammals, even hippos. For one thing, they don't have back legs. And their nostrils are on the top of their heads. This can lead us to make a couple of predictions. First, if the ancestors of whales lived on land, we would predict that there should exist fossils of animals more like whales than they are like other animals, but that have 4 legs. And we would also predict that those hind legs should be larger in older fossils and progressively smaller as the fossils get younger. And when fossils of animals with attributes found today only in whales started to turn up, this is exactly the pattern that we found. Many whales even have vestigial pelvic remnants today, and modern whales are still sometimes even born with hind flippers, as the code for hind limbs are still in their DNA. Not to mention the fact they have fingers. And second, we would predict that if the ancestors of whales lived on land, we should find fossils of animals more like whales than they are like other animals, but with nostrils located at the end of the face. And that younger fossils should have the nostrils closer and closer to the top of the head. And we found that to be the case as well. So it seems that whales are indeed the descendants of terrestrial mammals. Not only does it make logical sense, but it is supported by the evidence that we can observe today. And that gets us back to this thing. What is it? And how does it fit in with the other whales? And are there other crazy groups of whales out there that have somehow flown under my radar? Or, since we're talking about whales, my sonar? The whales, infraorder Cetacea, are divided into two large clades. The toothed whales, Odontoceti, and the baleen whales, Mysticeti. Now you'll probably notice that both of these names end in the Latin ceti, which refers to a large sea monster. Appropriate. Odonto refers to teeth, which makes a lot of sense. Misty may refer to whalebone, a common name in the past for baleen, but it's probably more related to a transcriptional error from the writings of Aristotle. Today, there are 9 extant families of toothed whales and 3 families of baleen whales. And since my personal favorite whale is in the Odontoceti, we'll start there. In fact, let's just start with my favorite whale, the unfortunately named sperm whale, and its closest relative, the dwarf sperm whale. Sperm whales are the only members of the family Physeteridae. Physeter macrocephalus. Macro meaning big and cephalus meaning head. They have huge heads. And they can grow to be over 20 meters long, almost 70 feet, the largest of all of the toothed whales, though most are somewhat smaller, with males being considerably larger than females. And almost a third of that length is just head. Macrocephalus. So why the huge head? Well, for one thing, they have the largest brain on Earth. But that really isn't the reason for the giant noggin. Their skull is actually long and skinny, unlike their heads, which are huge and bulbous. Most of it is filled with a liquid mixture of fats and waxes called spermaceti. Spermaceti was originally mistaken by whalers as being their semen, hence the unfortunate common name. But what it actually does is amplify the clicking sounds they use for echolocation and communication. It is also possible that it has a role in diving, though this is somewhat unsubstantiated. At the very least, it is important and it helps the whales hunt in the pitch black darkness. They can dive down as much as 2 kilometers, well over a mile, in search of their prey, giant squid. Big males will even hunt colossal squid under Antarctica, though they also hunt octopodes, sharks, rays, and smaller squid species. They're just unbelievably cool. They're found in waters all over the world. A few years ago, I had the huge privilege of seeing one off the coast of California, just a few meters from shore. I could identify it by its lack of a dorsal fin, wrinkly appearance, and blowhole located at the end of the nose and off to the left. It's my favorite whale. Their closest relatives are the much smaller dwarf and pygmy sperm whales of the family Kogiidae. The reality is that you're never going to confuse a kogiid whale with a sperm whale. They are much smaller, with short, blunt heads with jaws adapted to suction feeding. They also lack the wrinkly appearance and possess a dorsal fin. They have a structure behind their heads that looks like, but isn't, a gill slit. Like their cousins, they have the spermaceti organ and dive deep to hunt squid, though not as deep, and they hunt much smaller squid. They also have very large brains. They are also found in oceans all over the world, except they do not go into the polar regions like their cousins. These 2 families are the most distantly related families to the other toothed whales. The next most distantly related family are the South Asian river dolphins of the family Platanistidae. These are freshwater dolphins from the rivers in Nepal, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I say dolphins because these aren't really dolphins. They are toothed whales that look a bit like dolphins, but in reality, all of the toothed whales that we will mention after this point are more closely related to dolphins than are the platanistid whales. In fact, only the baleen whales and the 2 sperm whale families are less closely related to the dolphins. So they aren't dolphins, but they are quite interesting. Like dolphins, they have long, thin jaws, often called a beak. Jaws of this nature are indicative of many fish-eating animals such as gharials, garfishes, herons, and true dolphins. Such jaws allow animals that do not practice suction feeding to catch fish using a sideways swiping action. Their teeth, like those of the gharial, interlock like a zipper and are visible even when the mouth is shut. Like other river dolphins, they live in rivers where visibility is often limited, so they have poor eyesight and hunt primarily with echolocation. And when I say poor, I mean they don't even have a lens in their eyes. They likely only detect light and darkness with their eyes. These guys are easily identified because they are the only cetaceans that swim on their sides, like flounders. They're small for cetaceans, ranging in size from about 2 to just a bit over 2.5 meters. Females are longer than males mostly because they have longer jaws as adults. They also lack the dorsal fin of true dolphins. These are very endangered, but if you are near a river in or around northern India and you see a dolphin that swims on its side and looks like its parents didn't choose one another based on sight, you probably have found a South Asian river dolphin. The next most distantly related family is the one that I discovered just a few years back that inspired this whole video. And speaking of this video, if you're enjoying it to this point and would like to see more like it in the future, please subscribe to this channel. But as for the whales that inspired this video, these are the beaked whales of the family Ziphioidae. These guys range in size from about 4 to 13 meters and weigh between 1 and 15 tons. So they're one of the bigger whales we've discussed so far, and yet I didn't know that they even existed. And as it turns out, they're one of the least well-known of all whales, so I guess my embarrassment could be worse. I mean, some people don't know that snakes have skeletons. It could be worse. Of course, you know, they probably don't have degrees in zoology, so. Anyway, these are fairly mysterious whales that are rarely encountered. They do seem to hang out in the deep ocean. They look essentially like giant stretched out dolphins. It's like they took a big dolphin and then added several meters of extra body between the dorsal fin and the pectoral fins. From the little that we know about them, it seems that only males have teeth that protrude from the gums, and they use them in combat with other males. They usually only have 1 or 2 tusk-like pairs of teeth, and sometimes they actually inhibit feeding, so they're not for catching food. In fact, despite having jaws somewhat like those of dolphins, beaked whales are primarily suction feeders, feeding at depths of up to 500 meters primarily on squid that they find using echolocation. They're found in oceans all over the world, but only where those oceans are deep, hence they're rarely seen. The next most distantly related clade of toothed whales include 2 families. These families are the South American river dolphins of the family Iniidae, which I had the opportunity to see in the wild earlier this year during my time in the Amazon. I'll put a whole playlist of videos from that trip right here, just in case you want to see what else we saw. And the La Plata dolphin of the family Pontoporeidae, which I had no idea even existed. So the answer is yes, there are even more cetaceans that have completely managed to swim under my sonar. Now let's be clear, neither of these are true dolphins. But again, they have a similar form because long skinny jaws are good for catching fish. So let's start with the one I did know about, the one I just got to see while in Peru, the river dolphins of the family Iniidae. These guys are another freshwater cetacean, and they are built for maneuverability over speed. They have highly flexible necks that allow them to turn their heads quite a lot. Their dorsal fins are greatly reduced so they don't get caught on obstacles. They also have relatively poor vision and hunt a wide diversity of prey primarily using echolocation. They are the largest of the river dolphins, with some males being as long as 2.5 meters and weighing over 400 pounds. Females, on the other hand, are considerably smaller. Though they once had a larger range, this family is now found only in South American river systems. And we will soon have a whole video about them because there are some crazy legends regarding these unusual cetaceans. Apparently they're quite evil. Now, their closest living relatives are a group of cetaceans that I only discovered to exist because I was making this video. This would be the La Plata dolphin of the family Pontoporidae. And, like their closest living relatives, these two are not true dolphins. And this is the only river dolphin that doesn't live exclusively in fresh water. They spend a lot of time in the brackish waters off the coast of southeastern South America. Brackish waters are waters where salt concentrations are higher than fresh water, but lower than the ocean, and are usually found where fresh water flows into the sea. These are some of the smallest cetaceans, maxing out at under 6 feet. Well under 2 meters, and up to 15% of that length is just their beak-like jaws. These have the longest jaws for their length of any cetacean. They only weigh around 100 pounds. But they look more like true dolphins than the other river dolphins, probably because they're out in open waters more than other river dolphins. They sort of look like small, tiny-eyed, long-faced bottlenose dolphins. And they pretty much just cruise around slowly on the ocean floor eating whatever they can catch and watching out for sharks and orcas. Like most river dolphins, they have some dinky eyeballs, so I would assume that they're using mostly echolocation to find prey and detect predators. And that gets us to the largest clade of toothed whales, the Delphinoidea. This clade contains the final 3 toothed whale families: the Monodontidae, the belugas and narwhals, the Phocinidae, the porpoises, and the Delphinidae, the true dolphins. Of those 3, the 2 most related to one another are the Monodontidae and the Phocinidae. The Monodontidae contains 2 of the most wonderful of all cetaceans. These would be the belugas and the narwhals. These 2 amazing whales both live in the Arctic Ocean as well as the northernmost regions of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. They are between 3 and 5 meters long. They have a ridge down their back, but no dorsal fin. Their necks are highly flexible, unlike most whales that have fused neck vertebrae. And they do not have long beaks that protrude past the melon, like many of the other toothed whales we've been discussing. Though male narwhals do have something pretty amazing protruding past their melons. Now, I really don't know which one is more amazing. I mean, male narwhals look basically like spotted belugas with a unicorn horn protruding from their faces. That horn is actually a modified left canine tooth, a tusk, that protrudes from their upper jaw. Belugas, on the other hand, are beautiful all-white whales that seem to have the most playful demeanor, perhaps of any creature. I've seen them playing fetch in the wild with fishermen on their boats, and in captivity they just seem like they're having a great time all of the time. It's hard to say there is a more lovable animal anywhere. They just bring joy to the soul. The closest relatives to these 2 delightful whales are the porpoises of the family Phocinidae. Though they're more closely related to belugas and narwhals than they are to dolphins, they look a heck of a lot like dolphins. Probably mostly due to the fact that their necks are not highly flexible and they have dorsal fins. If you find yourself staring into the mouth of a cute little dolphin-like whale, you might notice that it has flat teeth instead of the cone-shaped teeth of dolphins. It might also lack the long beak possessed by the majority of dolphins. If this turns out to be the case, you are probably looking at a porpoise and not a dolphin. Like I said, these guys are pretty small, between 1.4 and 2.3 meters when fully grown, with all of them weighing less than an adult male gorilla. Which isn't small, but for a whale it's dinky. Like pretty much all members of the toothed whales, and particularly the Delphinoidea, they are carnivores that eat fish, mollusks, and about any other animal they can capture, kill, and swallow. They are found across the world's oceans and even in some freshwater habitats, such as the Yangtze River. They hunt using echolocation, like pretty much all toothed whales. Now, the main group that you might confuse with the porpoises would be their closest relatives, other than the belugas and narwhals, the true dolphins of the family Delphinidae. This is the most speciose of all whale families. True dolphins can range in size from over a meter to almost 10 meters, over 30 feet. You're probably familiar with the bottlenose dolphin, like Flipper, but you may be surprised to find out that species like pilot whales and orcas are also dolphins. Most are closer in size and shape to bottlenose dolphins with a long beak protruding past their melon, but that is clearly not present in all species. They have inflexible necks like porpoises, but cone-shaped teeth that really set them apart. Dolphins are exceedingly intelligent. Orcas have the second largest brain of any animal on Earth, behind only my favorite whale, the sperm whale. The brain of a bottlenose dolphin, while smaller than the orca brain, is both larger and more complex than a human brain. You choose what to do with that information. With around 40 species described, they are found in ocean habitats all over the world. And that brings us to the other big clade of whales, the Mysticedae baleen whales. And when I say big, well, there are only 3 families and about 16 species of baleen whales. But they include the biggest animals that have ever existed on this planet. So the group may not be as diverse as the toothed whales, with only 16 species, but they are huge. I mean, the smallest of them all is 6 meters or 20 feet long and well over 3 tons. And again, the largest is the largest animal ever to live on this planet. So it seems absurd to call them a small group, even if there are only 16 species. Baleen whales are differentiated from the toothed whales by the fact that they have baleen instead of teeth. Baleen is not a modified tooth. It is composed of keratin, like fingernails and hair, and is derived from the skin. They do develop teeth before birth, but they're soon lost, and they're not used for feeding. Baleen varies in length from half a meter to about 3.5 meters, almost 12 feet depending on the species. Baleen whales do not generally hunt large prey as do toothed whales, but rather hunt massive numbers of tiny prey, such as schools of fish, krill, and plankton. Now, generally, the amounts of energy provided by such small prey is not sufficient to justify large animals hunting it down. It certainly wouldn't justify the largest animals ever to exist on this planet hunting it down, but baleen makes this possible. Whales scoop up enormous quantities of water into their mouths, which include schools of fish, krill, or plankton. But instead of swallowing the water, which would fill their stomachs and greatly reduce the quantity of prey that they could actually swallow and process, they push the water out through the baleen and sift out the animals. In addition to baleen, members of the clade Mysticedae can be identified by their blowholes, as they have paired blowholes instead of the single blowhole possessed by the toothed whales. The 3 Mysticedae families are the Balanidae, the Balanopteridae, and the Cedotheridae. The smallest of these families, and I mean that in every sense of the word, is the family Cedotheridae. This family today is composed of only 1 species, the dainty little pygmy right whale. As we mentioned earlier, these guys are only about the size of an F-350 Super Duty, and are the smallest of the baleen whales, though they are the size of a pretty darn huge pickup truck. I mean, they're born as long as an NBA center. The rest of the family are all extinct, and some phylogenies even dispute including the pygmy right whales in the Cedotheridae, which would make it even smaller, with 0 living species. Assuming that they are part of the family, there is just the 1 species, and these guys live in a small band of temperate waters in the southern hemisphere where they feed on schools of tiny crustaceans. They've only been observed a handful of times at sea, and most of what we know about them comes from dead individuals that have washed up on shore. Their closest living relatives are, interestingly enough, not the right whales. So pygmy right whale is probably a bad common name for them. They're more closely related to the rorquals of the family Balanopteridae. I'll be honest, rorqual was a new word to me. But these are some familiar whales. Among the 10 rorqual species are whales like gray whales, humpback whales, and the largest animal ever to exist on planet Earth, the blue whale. This group can be easily identified by the folds extending from just behind their lower jaws, often down to their bellies, allowing for tremendous expansion when feeding. They're found in oceans all over the world. These whales are also much more streamlined in appearance than the final family of baleen whales, the family Balenidae. This family contains 3 species of right whales, as well as the bowhead whale. And bowhead isn't a bad description. They have faces that look a little bit like a pelican with its gular pouch full of water. They have a very narrow upper jaw and a much larger lower jaw, and their mouth often forms a bow-like shape. They look deeply, deeply dissatisfied with the world. Maybe it's because they aren't the closest relatives of the pygmy right whales, and that just isn't right. More like pygmy wrong whales, right? Am I right? Moving on. This crazy mouth allows them to have huge baleen and to feed in a way very different from what the other baleen whales do. Instead of gulping in huge amounts of water and pushing it back out through the baleen, they practice ram feeding. They just swim near the surface for minutes at a time with their mouths open, gathering small animals on their baleen, and then they scrape them off with their huge tongues like Jabba the Hutt. They're found in temperate and tropical waters in both the northern and southern hemispheres. And those are all of the whales. And that brings us to the last clade in the Lorasiatheria, and the closest relatives of the eungulates, the carnivorans. This is a cat. And this is a dog. This is also a cat. And this is also a dog. This looks like a dog, but it is closer to being a cat. This is called a sea lion, but it's closer to being a dog. And this is a panda. It's a bear. And this is a panda. It's not a bear. But you know what they all are? Carnivorans. And I recognize that they aren't all carnivores, but they are all part of the diverse and amazing mammal clade Carnivora, which certainly does not contain all carnivores, but it does include most of the carnivorous mammals. And if it's not the single coolest mammal clade, it certainly has to be part of the discussion. Plus, if you're ever going to get killed and eaten by a mammal, odds are it'll be one of these guys. So let's dig into the Carnivora. What they are, how they're related, and which ones are the most likely to eat you. Oh, and I think we need to finally try to figure out what this is. Okay, so Carnivora. Carnivorans are placental eutherian mammals most closely related to ungulates like horses, antelopes, and whales. Possibly pangolins as well. Yeah, we probably need to dig into that group here pretty soon. But whereas most ungulates are herbivores, most carnivorans are carnivores, at least on some level. Which isn't to say that a cow will not eat a little bird when given the chance. And I won't show you that. Some of you guys didn't like it when I showed you that before. Interestingly, in a video on some of the members of this very clade. But carnivorans are not only willing to opportunistically eat meat like a cow, but in many cases, they're built to procure it. And here is a question that I once had about this group and how they procure meat. Cats, when compared to dogs, seem like they have a lot more going for them. They can get larger, they're often smarter, they're better leapers, they can be faster, they have devastating claws in addition to a devastating bite. Dogs often work well in groups, but cats can as well. In a world where cats exist, how have dogs managed to compete? I do now have an answer to this question, but it is definitely one that I think we should address in this video. So let's dive into this clade. Carnivorans can be identified generally by their large canine teeth and their 3 lower incisors, though reduced numbers are found in some groups. Their eyes tend to be forward-facing, and they generally have 4 back toes and 5 on the front, but that too is not a hard and fast rule. What truly unites them as a group is ancestry. The group Carnivora is divided into 2 major clades. The Feliformia, the cat-form carnivorans, and the Caniformia, the dog-form carnivorans. To get to that dogs versus cats question, we will clearly need to discuss both groups. But to figure out what this is, well, both of the good options are in the Feliformia. So let's start with the cat-form carnivorans, and then we'll make our way over to man's best friend and his smelly and seafaring cousins. And the one thing that best identifies members of the Feliformia are these two lumps on the bottom of the skull. These are called the auditory bullae. And in feliforms, each one has two chambers divided by a bony septum that you can see if you look in through this hole right here. Completely divides the two chambers. So that is the best way to tell them apart from the Caniformia. And it works really well if you find a skull, like this one here that my brother-in-law found. But it can get you into a lot of trouble at the zoo if you're trying to spot that on the animals there. So to keep you out of zoo jail, I'll tell you that felids also tend to have shorter snouts and fewer teeth than caniforms. And within the Feliformia, there is a group of animals called civets. They go right here. I only bring them up because the family of extant feliforms least closely related to all of the other members of the Feliformia is the family Nandinidae, a family which today includes only one species, the African palm civet, which is not a civet. In fact, to find a living animal less related to civets, you would need to go completely outside of the Feliformia. There is not a single living feliform less related to civets than our African palm civets. Though civets, along with all of the remaining feliforms, are the closest living relatives of African palm civets. So these aren't civets, but at a glance, I can see how they got that name. They do look a great deal like civets. African palm civets live in Central Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, and look a bit like a spotted cat had a baby with a meerkat. So you ended up with kind of a weasel-shaped spotted brown or gray creature with a cat-like, but too long to be a cat, and definitely a tad mongoose-ish face. But then you got sad that it didn't look enough like a cat, so you cut off its tail and glued on a tiger's tail, even though the tail was longer than the whole animal, and you color matched the fur, but left the stripes, even though the body was spotted. Then you gave it some orange eyes because you missed the orange from the tiger, and they still turned out cute as a button. That's what they look like. They're cool little animals, but civets they are not. They're barely even feliforms. In fact, they are the hagfish of Feliformia. The remaining feliforms fall into two clades, the Pheloidea, which includes the cats, and the Viveroidea, which includes the civets. Neither of these two clades are more closely related to African palm civets than the other, and each one contains a candidate for what this might be. So let's start with the Viveroidea, so we can find out what a civet actually is. But again, remember that civets are no more closely related to African palm civets than are any of the other members of these two clades. And they are more closely related to all of the members of both of these clades than they are to African palm civets. But the viveroid family most distantly related to all of the other viveroids is the family Viveridae. The 33 species of civets, palm civets, excluding the African palm civet, genets, oyans, and the popcorn-smelling binturong. And just to ruin your day, the binturong is just another palm civet. So I suggest that we rename it the popcorn palm civet, as is the otter civet. It ought to be a palm civet too. So lots of things are palm civets, just not African palm civets. But you know what palm civets aren't? Civets, which are closer to oyans and genets. But just look at all these weasel kitties and possum cats. Some of them really look a lot like a ferret and a cat had a baby. The word viveridae even means ferret in Latin, though we're in the wrong clade to be talking about ferrets. So they aren't ferrets, and they definitely aren't possums, but they are so adorable. They're found in Africa, Asia, and Europe. They're small to medium-sized, though binturongs are relatively large. Popcorn palm civets. They're pretty big, like the size of a standard poodle. But most of them are pretty small by comparison, more like the size of a house cat. And, like a house cat, they have somewhat retractable claws and a rough tongue. But they have a longer muzzle than cats, and their shearing teeth are somewhat less specialized. It's an amazingly cute and fun group, and it probably deserves its own video eventually. The rest of the viveroids fall into the clade Herpistoidea, which contains 3 families. And the third wheel of this clade are these, the 3 species of hyenas and the aardwolf of the family Hyenidae, which really look like dogs, or wolves, apparently, but are more closely related to cats, and even more so, to mongooses. As hunters, though, they are much more similar to dogs. Their claws are non-retractable and are used more like cleats than like knives, and if you don't understand the difference, you've been playing soccer all wrong. And given that cleats make lousy knives, they use their strong jaws almost exclusively to dispatch their prey. It also means that they're lousy climbers. I do not recommend climbing trees with cleats on your hands and feet. So they are runners. Not the only runners among the Feliformia. In fact, there is a cat that is similar to the hyenas in all of these ways, the cheetah. But hyenas hunt more like dogs even than they do like cheetahs. Cheetahs are adapted for speed, but not endurance. Hyenas and dogs are almost the opposite of that. Pursuit hunters that sometimes simply run prey to exhaustion. A cheetah cannot do that. Almost all of the animals that cheetahs hunt can run for longer than they can, just not faster. However, in most other ways, hyenas are more like their feliform cousins. But when it comes to hunting and the adaptations for hunting, they are very convergently similar to dogs. So why would a feliform be so much like a dog in a world with dogs? That's a great question. They originated in Eurasia and were once very widely distributed in that region. And many of them were even more like dogs in form and function than what we see today. Because hunting like a dog, it works. It's different than hunting like a cat, but it works. In some cases, better than hunting like a cat. And at one point in time, in Eurasia and Africa, there were no dogs. Canids evolved in North America, so that niche was wide open. And yes, that is not only a correct English pronunciation of the word niche, it was the only pronunciation of the word in English until recently when people decided to French it up. And in the same way, hyenas were the only dog-like carnivorans on that side of the planet until just a few million years ago when the Beringian land bridge allowed canids into Asia for the first time. And it seems that, by and large, canids are even better at being dogs than our hyenas. As a result, the primarily insectivorous aardwolf is the only surviving member of the more dog-like hyenas. The other three are from a different clade of hyenas called bone-crushing hyenas, which can hunt, but also make excellent scavengers. What I'm saying is that the canids won the battle for top dog. And those hyenas that persisted were those that occupied slightly different niches than their canid competitors. And this is actually a common theme that we're going to see between the Feliformia and the Caniformia. Because the Feliforms originated in Africa and Eurasia, and the Caniforms originated in North America, essentially in two different worlds. And in those two worlds, they evolved to fill many of the same niches. So you see a lot of convergence in the two clades, especially before their worlds collided. And there are situations just like this, not only between feliforms and caniforms, but even within the groups, like with this place, Madagascar. In our video about all of the Afrotheria, we discussed the fact that for much of the history of mammals, Africa was its own little world. And as such, it only had a small subset of mammal lineages, which subsequently radiated out to fill many of the mammal niches. Well, off the coast of Africa lies Madagascar, an island off the coast of an island with very few lineages and many open niches. And just like what we saw with the lemurs filling all of the primate niches, as well as being woodpeckers, when the first carnivorans arrived on the Inception Island, they were like, "What's up, my niches?" And they diversified all over that hizzy. And this single lineage of feliforms are today known as the family Eupleridae, also called Malagasy mongooses, which are only arguably mongooses. They are the closest living relatives of the true mongooses, so they can all be mongooses, or not. They're the hagfish of mongooses. But no matter what you call them, they're rad. And one of the 10 extant species might be the one that we're seeing here. So what is this thing? Well, in our first TikTok reaction video, I said that I thought it was a fossa, or fusa. This. And that is because it is a very cat-like creature, but with a rather long body. Shortish legs, but a very long tail and a long face, like a stretch cat. And in Madagascar, there is such a beast, the fossa. Well, it isn't a cat, though it is arguably a mongoose, as is the rest of the family. All of the Malagasy mongooses can trace their lineage to a single colonization event from Africa. They are all more closely related to one another than they are to anything else. And though the fossa is probably the best known of the Malagasy mongooses, it is actually a pretty odd member of the group. Others include the closest living relative to the fossa, the Malagasy civet. I'll give you one guess what that isn't. A civet. Let's face it, the common ancestor of all feliforms probably looked like a civet. So there be fake civets all over the place in this clade. You can distinguish it easily from the true civets by figuring out if you're in Madagascar or not. This group also includes the Phalanaux and the Vontziras. A couple of the Vontziras are often called mongooses and not Vontziras, and that can be okay. Just know that they're also Vontziras, and if they're mongooses, so are all of the other endemic Malagasy carnivorans. But it's a cute group of things that look like mongooses, civets, red pandas, and cats, but that are, at best, none of these things, except for mongooses. I love that red panda weasel. So I think this creature may have been a fossa, but I have no idea if this video comes from Madagascar. And the fact that the head and body appear to be slightly different shades of brown has me doubting that this truly is what we're seeing here. There is another creature that fits this description on the other side of the world, so we'll have to check out that possibility as well. But first, we have to talk about the closest relatives of the Malagasy mongooses. The 34 species of non-Malagasy mongooses of the family Herpestidae, some of which are frequently called meerkats and kusimanses. But unless you kick out 6 species of mongooses and all of the Malagasy mongooses as well, then they're totally mongooses too. And just so you know, mongooses is the more broadly accepted plural of mongoose, though mongoose is also acceptable. But nobody calls multiple meerkats meerkitties. Mongooses of the unquestionably mongoosish variety are found in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And they are incredible hunters. Many are notorious for hunting large and sometimes dangerous prey, such as scorpions and cobras. And they are highly immune to the neurotoxins of elapid snakes. And that takes us to the other major clade of the Feliformia, the even more cat-like Phyloidea, which does include the cats. And these, the 2 species of linsangs of the family Prianodontidae, which also very much show that ancestral feliform body plan. Long body, long tail, with a face longer than that of a cat. Morphologically, it looks like a civet, and every other feliform that people want to call a civet. Thank goodness for molecular phylogenetics, which can give us a window into evolutionary history that is much less biased by human perceptions and similarities due to convergence. Like I said previously, this is likely the ancestral body plan of feliforms. If you saw the common ancestor of the group, it probably looked basically like a civet. And that body plan has been very successful across Asia, Africa, and Europe, with some groups landing in places like Africa and Madagascar, which had a lot of open niche space, allowing feliforms to diversify down paths that are generally unavailable in parts of the world where other lineages have filled those spaces. But just because a few lineages have changed dramatically, that doesn't mean that this ancestral form ceases to be successful. And so most of the lineages still look something like these guys, even though they aren't necessarily one another's closest relatives. Linsangs, true linsangs, come from Southeast Asia. And I say true linsangs because the oyans that we discussed earlier, part of the Viveridae, they are sometimes called linsangs, but they clearly are not. I say clearly, but again, if all you had to work with was morphology, you'd probably call them all civets. The reality is that based on the clear molecular data, if you want to include another group into the oyans, it would be these, the hagfish of oyans, the 41 species of cats of the family Felidae, which, despite being the namesake of the Feliformia, might be the weirdest of all feliforms. And is anyone else surprised that there are only 41 species? I tell you what, go ahead and subscribe and I'll make a video doing a deep dive into this group in the next couple of months. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about them today. That would be outrageous, and we still need to figure out what this is. In general, you can probably distinguish a cat from most animals, though a few other feliforms might trip you up. Cats have fully retractable claws, except for cheetahs, which aren't big cats, not even close, but we'll get into that in a couple of months. They have somewhat shorter faces, shorter bodies, and shorter tails compared to most other feliforms. Originally evolving in Asia, they have also been very successful in Africa and are the only extant feliform lineage to have successfully colonized the Americas at the time when the Caniformia made their way into Asia. Though there was a North American hyena for most of the last 5 million years. In general, the Caniformia has won the battle between the two clades, but felids, more than any other lineage, have managed to hold their own. They've not only managed to persist in the presence of caniforms, but in many cases are the apex predators in the regions where they're found. Some tigers, for example, even specialize in hunting bears. They may not have the endurance of dogs, but as we said in the beginning, they have exceptional weapons and athletic ability. There is only one predator on Earth that I would fear even perched atop an adult elephant. I'll give you a hint. It's not a dog. They range in size far, far more than do other feliform lineages. From the rusty spotted cat, which weighs less than 2 kilos, to the Siberian tiger, which can weigh over 300 kilos. They have excellent vision, keen intelligence, and are experts of ambush. They are the fastest running animals alive, have astounding leaping ability, skull-splintering bite force, and there is considerable evidence that they domesticated humans. It includes many cats that look a lot like house cats, including the other members of the genus Felis, but also from other groups like the genus Prionolorus and most of the genus Leopardus, even though my favorite cat, also part of that genus, doesn't look that much like a house cat in my opinion. Some look more like bobcats and lynxes, and some are big cats like lions, tigers, and the diversity of things we call leopards. But there is in the Americas a cat that is one of the closest relatives of the African cheetah that looks like, well, more like a fossa than it does like most cats. Which isn't to say that it doesn't look like a cat, but fossas look a lot like cats, despite not being cats. They're cats like lemurs or monkeys. This is a jaguarundi. They live in the Americas, mostly in Central America and South America east of the Andes Mountains, but also in Mexico. It has a long body and relatively short legs, with a long tail and a head that is slightly different in color from the body, which at this point, I'm about 90% sure is the animal that we're seeing here. I still don't know where this video was filmed, but jaguarundis are active mostly during the day, have very similar colors and a similar shape. The head shape is the only thing that still has me doubting a bit, but the longer I look at this, the more I think that the unidentified creature from this video is a jaguarundi. So I think I got this one wrong before. What do you think? Well, I think that this brings us to the end of the feliforms, which brings us to the other major clade of the carnivorans, arguably the more successful of the two clades, the Caniformia, which includes everything from giant pandas to red pandas to trash pandas, walruses to wolves to weasels, and everything in between. It's about all of the diversity that a person can bear, plus it has bears. Caniformia can most easily be distinguished from Feliformia by an examination of the bottom of the skull, where the feliforms have two-chambered auditory bullae, this little part of the skull right here. The separation in caniforms is incomplete or non-existent. It's just a single chamber. Their claws are generally, but not always, not retractable. And most walk with their whole foot on the ground, plantigrade, where the feliforms tend to be digitigrade, walking on their toes. Caniforms also tend to have longer jaws and more teeth than feliforms. And the scissor-like shearing teeth, called the carnassials, are much less well developed for that task than they are in the Feliformia. They are also much more inclined towards omnivory than are the feliforms, though it doesn't make them any less carnivorans. Remember, this is a clade, not a description of dietary preferences. The two carnivoran lineages originated in two separate worlds. Feliformia in the Old World, Africa, Asia, and Europe, and the Caniformia in the New World, specifically in North America. And this is the case because North and South America were at this point not yet connected. And we discussed that in our video on the marsupials. It's a dandy, by the way. And if you've watched that video, you'll also understand why this means that there are no native canids in Australia, but there are marsupials from South America. And yes, I know about dingoes. I'll talk about them here soon. Interestingly, of all of the dog-form carnivorans, the family least closely related to the rest of the group is the family Canidae, the dogs. That's right, there are no native dogs in Australia, and dogs are the hagfish dog-form carnivorans. But it also means that dogs have been diversifying for more time than what separates walruses from skunks. So the canids are a pretty diverse family, and a very, very successful family. When we discussed the most dog-like of the Feliformia, the hyenas, we talked about some of the advantages that dogs have over cats. And the main thing is that while dogs do not have the weapons and power of cats, they make up for it with persistence. Which is probably why your cat can only put up with you for a few minutes at a time, but your dog's enthusiasm for you is boundless. But it has more to do with the fact that dogs excel at running prey down over long distances, often cooperatively. Generally with members of their own species, but sometimes with other caniforms, like badgers, and sometimes with other persistence hunters, like us. At some point, we need a full video about just this family. And we're gonna dive in at least a bit into this group here in just a second. But I don't think I can just tell you about that badger thing and then move on. Have you ever tried to grab a ground squirrel or a prairie dog with your face? Just for the record, prairie dogs are not dogs. They're rodents. We'll talk about rodents soon, so subscribe and click the little bell so you don't miss that. But no matter what they are, they're difficult to grab with your face. And there are two reasons that they're hard to grab with your face. They can run and they can hide. Underground to be specific. Well, prairie dogs are not dogs, but there are a couple of dog-like carnivorans that would like to grab them with their faces. Since, unlike feliforms, caniforms can pretty much only grab stuff with their faces. And two of these caniforms that would love to grab prairie not dogs with their dog or dog-like faces are coyotes and badgers. But prairie dogs are hard for either of them to grab with their faces. Coyotes are great runners. Remember, that's the strength of dogs in general. They are great runners. But once a prairie dog goes underground, the chase is over. Badgers, which are more closely related to seals than to coyotes, are good at getting underground. Once they run, there's really nothing the badger can do. It's like rock, paper, scissors, and the prairie dog always wins.
Rock, paper, scissors, match. All right, rock beats paper.
I thought paper covered rock.
Ah, rock flies right through paper.
Well, what beats rock?
Nothing beats rock.
All right, come on. Rock, paper, scissors, match. Rock,
Rock,
rock, paper, scissors, match. Rock, rock.
Well, that is unless paper and scissors work together. And that is exactly what coyotes and badgers do. There's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide where the face of a true caniform can't get you. Now, canids are unusual among the caniformes as they run on their toes, digitigrade like feliforms. They are the hagfish of the group after all. Canids don't vary in size as much as felids, mostly because they don't get as big as some of the biggest cats. On the small end, they're about the same size as the smallest felids. The fennec fox, one of my favorite mammals, by the way, is smaller than 2 kilos when fully grown. But the largest of the roughly 35 extant species of canids, gray wolves, they don't even get to 80 kilos. That's a terrifying wolf that could definitely kill you, especially with his buddies, but that would be one tiny tiger. Even the largest canid known to have ever existed, Epicyon, was only about 170 kilos. Epicyon, interestingly enough, was a bone-crushing dog that filled a similar role to modern bone-crushing hyenas, which are the main group of hyenas that have survived once dogs made their way into the old world. Canids include things like coyotes, wolves, foxes, dogs, jackals, things called jackals that are closer to being wolves, things called wolves that are closer to being foxes, but are part of a group of foxes that are more closely related to wolves than they are to the other foxes, foxes that are more closely related to those wolf foxes than they are to other foxes. Basically, everything small is called a fox, no matter what it is. If it's big, it's a wolf. If it's in the middle, then we'll get creative. It's a fun group. If you want to see a whole video just about the canids in the near future, write, "Not all foxes are foxes," down in the comments. You know, if you're into that kind of thing. Oh, and if this is the kind of thing that you're into generally, we have a new limited edition shirt that might be perfect for you. Oh, and by the way, this is a raccoon dog. It's not a raccoon. And it's only a dog if all of the canids are dogs. And this is a dingo, which is definitely a dog, even if domestic dogs are the only dogs. Because dingoes are a feral dog, not a true wild dog. They are a lineage of domestic dogs introduced by humans to Australia just a few thousand years ago. But we'll get more into that when we talk about the canids. It's going to be a really fun video. But that takes us to the rest of the caniformia. All of the dog-form carnivorans that are more closely related to one another than they are to dogs. The not-so-dog-form carnivorans of the clade Arctoidea. The bear-like dog-form carnivorans. And, as you probably could have guessed based on what you've seen so far from the dog-form carnivorans, the family least closely related to all of the other bear-like dog-form carnivorans are the bears. Bears are the hagfish of bear-like dog-form carnivorans because, of course they are. But bears are amazing. They are the only family of carnivora that we have already discussed down to the species. Today, all 8 species of bears are found in the Americas and Eurasia, including the polar regions of the northern hemisphere. This distribution makes a lot of sense, given that bears, like canids, originated in North America and only made their way out during the times when North America became connected to Asia and South America. The only continent that they conceivably could have reached, where they're not found today, is Africa. And they were there until the late 1800s. The Atlas bear of northern Africa was hunted to extinction, and it seems that their further expansion was restricted by the Sahara Desert. So that is very unfortunate, though I could totally get behind an effort to bring them back. In general, habitat destruction is the primary means by which humans drive species to extinction. But animals like bears are large, conspicuous, they can only exist in low densities, and they make great candidates for hunting into extinction. But the fact that their ancestral habitat may still exist would make de-extinction much more viable. Like canids and other caniforms, bears have longer snouts than do most feliforms. Unlike canids, but like the rest of the caniforms, they walk on their entire foot, plantigrade, not digitigrade like canids and feliforms. They're also huge, with the smallest bears still getting to be about 65 kilos and the largest being about 10 times that size. Their claws are non-retractile, their ears are short and round, and their tails are relatively short, though not always as short as you might think. You can probably recognize a bear when you see one. And if you want to know more about them, remember that we already have a video detailing every species, so check that out next. But right now, we need to dig into the rest of the bear-like dog-form carnivorans. You know, all of the bear-like dog-form carnivorans that are more closely related to one another than they are to the bears or the dogs. Because, well, obviously. And this is where we get into 2 totally crazy lineages. One has skunks, otters, and true pandas, and the other has what I earlier said should be called water dogs instead of sea lions. But given that they are more closely related to bears, maybe these are the true water bears. Certainly tardigrades aren't. Though if you want a full video on tardigrades, feel free to comment "the water bears" down in the comments. But right now, we need to focus on the water bears. No, not those. Though, you're probably right, those are the true water bears. But I'm talking about these fin-footed, bear-like, dog-form carnivorans, the Pinnipedia. And I really think we ought to start here with the pinnipeds. These have got to be one of the 3 most specialized groups of aquatic mammals on the planet. The other 2 being the sirenians, that we discussed in our video about the Afrotheria, and the whales, which already have their own video. And while pinnipeds are more closely related to whales than they, or whales, are to sirenians, they aren't as closely related to whales as they are to skunks and badgers or even cats. Whales are ungulates, a group that we will jump into soon. The closest highly aquatic relatives of the pinnipeds are things like otters and minks, but they aren't more closely related to those than they are to wolverines or true pandas. Their similarities to whales are due to convergence, not shared ancestry. But really, they are very different from whales in many key ways. One being that they're much more able to move on land, but also in the way that they move in the water. Whales have greatly reduced hind limbs and use their fluked tails for propulsion through the water. Pinnipeds have flukeless, highly reduced tails and fin feet. Now, whales also have fin feet, but generally only 2, though there are exceptions. Pinnipeds have 4 fin-like feet that they use to propel themselves through the water. They're quadrupinnipeds. There are about 34 extant species in 3 families, ranging in size from around 45 kilos to well over 3,000 kilos. They can get huge. They are the only carnivorans to have colonized Antarctica, and the only carnivorans to have colonized Australia without the help of humans. Meaning that Carnivora, and indeed Caeniformia alone, has colonized every continent on Earth. Of the 3 families of pinnipeds, the family most distantly related to the other 2 are the 18 species of seals in the family Phocidae, also known as earless seals or true seals. And I can be persuaded that either common name is fine, but not both of them at the same time. And I'm not totally fine with either of them. Because these earless true seals, well, they do have ears. And they aren't the only pinnipeds called seals. This is a monitor lizard. See that hole on the side of its head? Guess what that is? An ear. This is a close relative of the monitor lizard. It's called an earless monitor. See that hole on the side of its head? Me either. Know why? They don't have any ear openings. Though they can hear, there is no external evidence of ears at all. So, earless monitor, it's not an unreasonable name. And you should definitely watch this video about that group. They're stinking rad. But where were we? Oh yeah, this is a seal. A true seal. An earless seal. And you see that hole on the side of its head? Guess what that is? An ear. There are no seals without ears. But I get it. Mammals generally have not only a hole for an ear, like these guys do, but also a fleshy, sound-funneling protuberance around the ear called a pinna, or pinnae if you're discussing more than one. And earless seals, they don't have them. So despite resembling a not earless monitor more than an earless monitor, I get calling them earless seals. Though I would greatly prefer to call them pinnaeless seals. But what I would really rather call them is seals. That is, unless they're not the only seals. Which they are not. At least they're not the only things called seals. Because there are also these. The fur seals. Which almost form a monophyletic group. Except for one species. Among the 15 species in the family Otariidae. The eared seals, a group of pinnipeds with both ears and pinnae, though many members are often called sea lions, despite being more closely related to raccoons. But if we include the sea lions as seals, given that they're eared seals, then the group is monophyletic and all is well. We have a group of eared seals and a group of earless seals, and though I would rather call them pinnaed seals and pinnaeless seals, I get it, it's fine. But it's not fine because of these. That's a walrus. And ironically, the walrus is kind of the Yoko of the seals. The only living member of the family Otobenidae. You can probably recognize one by its tusks. And you might be able to recognize that it is more closely related to the eared seals by its posture, which we will discuss here in a minute. But that is the beginning of our problem. Because walruses are more closely related to ear seals than eared seals are to earless seals. This means that if both fur seals and earless seals are seals, then so is the walrus. And that's fine. It would just mean that the true seals aren't the only true seals. And I know that we already mentioned the tusks that walruses have. But did you notice what they don't have? Pinnae. If eared seals and earless seals are both seals, then so are walruses. But they are just as earless as the earless seals, despite not being part of that clade. You could lump them in with the eared seals, but they would be earless eared seals. So even if you're okay calling pinnaeless seals earless, well, they aren't the only earless seals, unless you don't include the walruses as being seals, which would mean that the fur seals and the other eared seals aren't seals either, in which case true seals seems like a solid name to differentiate them from the false seals, such as the fur seals and other eared false seals. So yes, they would be true seals, and I suppose earless seals as well, though The latter seems unnecessary, as all seals would be earless, a bit like calling us wingless humans, or calling this thing a non-magic manatee, or a muggletee if you're British. And of course, eared seals can only be eared seals if they're actually seals, which would mean that the earless seals cease to exist as a group, so you have to pick one or the other there too. It's ugly. So maybe, and I'm just throwing this out there, let's discuss ways to differentiate them without relying exclusively on the presence or absence of ear pinnae, shall we? For now, I will call them seals, walruses, and sea lions that aren't closely related to lions. Fair? Walruses are easy. They have tusks. But even if you can't see the tusks, they're huge, weighing as much as 2,000 kilos, with serious whiskers. They have no ear pinnae, like seals, but can turn their hind flippers forward to facilitate movement on land. That said, they swim more like seals than they do like sea lions that aren't closely related to lions. And they have tiny little eyes proportionally. They spend their lives feeling around with their whiskers on the ocean floor for bivalve mollusks, and great vision is just not really needed when you live like that. I've never met a person that didn't like walruses, and I expect those of you in the comments section to keep it that way. Seals of the non-imposter variety are more variable in size. Obviously, they also don't have ear pinnae. While their whiskers are often proportionally longer than those of walruses, they aren't as densely packed. Their eyes are much larger, and they lack the ability to rotate their hind flippers forward, meaning that they tend to have a posture more like a beached mermaid and move more like Heimlich the caterpillar than like a walrus when on land. Though they are aided by long claws on their front flippers that help them pull themselves along. So they're not graceful on land, but in the water, they swim like fish. And I mean non-mammalian, with a side-to-side sinusoidal movement, which, again, is odd for a mammal. As we detailed in our video about whales, mammal spines bend up and down, and as such, they tend to use up and down movements when they swim. Well, this is not the case for walruses or seals. They swim side to side. And we'll have to do a full video on pinnipeds soon. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here. But when it comes to this side-to-side motion, keep in mind that they're kicking with their legs, not so much swimming with their spines like most other marine mammals. This group includes the largest and the scariest of the pinnipeds, which are not the same thing. Though the largest and the ugliest certainly would be the same thing. But leopard seals are truly terrifying. They're the only seals known to hunt other seals. And there are more documented cases of people being killed by wild leopard seals than by wild orcas. Seals are amazing. But what about the eared false seals? You know, sea lions that aren't closely related to lions, including the fur seals that aren't seals, unless earless seals aren't the only earless seals. The family Otteriidae, which has nothing to do with otters, despite the fact that they are much more closely related to otters than they are to lions. It has to do with their little ears, which you already know that they have. And they are the only ones with ear pinnae, so whether or not they are seals, they're definitely eared. They can flip their hind flippers around and are definitely the most graceful on land of all of the pinnipeds. And they're also very graceful in the water, though they swim very differently from other pinnipeds. They tend to generate thrust with their forelimbs, not the hind limbs. And given that the forelimbs are not needed as much to pull them around on land as with the phocids, their flippers tend to be longer, clawless, and more specialized for this type of swimming than for movement on land. In a nutshell, on the land or in the water, you shouldn't confuse these eared pinnipeds of uncertain designation with walruses or true seals. But what is this? I mean, it looks and acts a bit like a giant panda. It even has a false thumb for grasping bamboo, its primary food source, like a giant panda. It lives in about the same places as the giant panda, but it also looks a bit like a raccoon, a trash panda. It has a long stripy tail. It's about that size, weighing no more than about 15 kilos. So, what is it? Well, it's a panda. But that doesn't mean that I think it's closely related to a giant panda, because it isn't. Giant pandas are bears. They're the hagfish of bears. And this isn't a bear. This is the hagfish of the Mustaloidea, meaning that it is more closely related to a walrus than it is to a giant panda. So why then am I calling it a panda? Because it is a panda! The only panda. All others are just pretenders, false pandas if you will. You see, pandas, true pandas, these red pandas, the only color that pandas ever are, were first described in 1825. Panda was likely an English slight mispronunciation of the Nepali word for these true pandas, and thus they were called pandas. There was no need to call them red pandas. There was only one species of panda, the only member of the family Ailuridae. And then, more than 40 years later, in 1869, the hagfish of bears was described by someone who apparently was unfamiliar with bears. Because when he saw this, he went, "That looks like a giant panda." The movie Red is about a giant panda. Do you know what it doesn't look like? A black and white bear. So after more than 40 years as the only panda, the true panda suddenly had to share its name with one of the most charismatic creatures on the planet. And it became the lesser panda, or red panda. What a slap in the face. I mean, can you imagine if someone was born this year and we named her Beyonce, even though she was only distantly related to Beyonce Knowles, and we suddenly started calling Beyonce Knowles the lesser Beyonce? What would Marshall Mathers say if we started calling me Slim Shady and him the blonde Slim Shady?
I'm Slim Shady, yes, I'm the real Shady. All you other Slim Shadys are just imitating.
So won't the real panda please stand up? There you have it. So now we know what a panda is and what it isn't. We know that they are musteloids. I even called them the hagfish of musteloids, which they probably are. But they have a rival. These. The most reasonable candidate for a black and white panda, if you're committed to the existence of such an animal. The 12 species of skunks and stink badgers of the family Mephididae. While their exact relationship to pandas is still up for debate, they are clearly more closely related to pandas than are the high-contrast Chinese bamboo bears. Mephidids may even be the hagfish of pandas, in which case you could totally justify calling them stink pandas, though stink badger really isn't on the table. I have also seen them as the hagfish of musteloids, or the next most distantly related members of the musteloidia after the pandas. So let's hold off on the name handstand stench pandas until we get this node resolved. For now, we're gonna leave it as a polytomy, but I have my fingers crossed for them to become musk pandas someday. But wherever they land, they're one of my favorite mammals. I love skunks. They have pretty much everything that I love about an animal. They're one of those animals that people think are terrifying, but that turn out to be absolutely delightful. And a big reason that they're so delightful is because they are very well defended. They live by Teddy Roosevelt's adage, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Or stink in this case. Speak softly and carry a big stink. And then advertise very well that you have that big stink with some very conspicuous warning colors. That stink can be fired like pepper spray from a pair of glands flanking the anus of Mephidids. And the smell is, in a word, thick. I would argue that it is far from the worst smell that you can encounter. I have smelled things since having children that would bring tears to your eyes and stimulate a powerful gag reflex. And some of those horrible smelling things my dog would scarf up in a heartbeat if he had the chance. Because not all bad smells smell bad to all things. So having an unpleasant smell might not be of great value. But having a potent smell that can be detected at great range for an extended period of time, that is the kind of thing that can cost a predator its life. It is not improbable that many a predator has eaten skunk for its last meal. It just didn't know that it would be the last while it was happening. But as a result, the predators that are the most likely to reproduce, in the range of Mephidids at least, are those that see skunks and think, "Oh, better not." Even if they don't know what it is about them that makes them turn the other way. So predators benefit from avoiding skunks, and skunks benefit from being easily identifiable. Spraying a predator that eats you doesn't do you much good. So skunks have strong aposematic warning colors. Honestly, in the range of skunks, the only thing that might be confused with a skunk would be an actual badger. Also an animal best to leave alone. And converging on the same warning color for two dangerous animals, called Mullerian mimicry, only serves to strengthen the signal further. Now, the range of Mephidids is weird. They're in North America, and that should come as no surprise. They're caniforms. They're in South America, which isn't a huge shock. They're in North America, and you could walk from one to the other, at least until we made that canal down in Panama. I don't know what the bridge situation is like for that. So this makes sense. But they're not in Europe or Asia. They're not in Africa. So it looks like they didn't exist just yet the last time that it was possible to walk from North America to Asia. And that's fine, though that would pretty much settle that the pandas are the hagfish of mustaloids. But it doesn't. Because the two species of stink badgers, with their tiny little tails, are found in Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, and the Philippines. That's in the middle of the ocean, right between Asia and Australia. Which would be positively baffling if it weren't for the fact that we find mephiid fossils in Europe and Asia. They made it over, they just didn't make it there. So the question about where the pandas belong is still an open one. And by the way, stink badgers, they're not badgers. But neither are most badgers, so I guess we'd better get to the last two carnivoran families to make some sense of that. The last two families in the carnivora do appear to be one another's closest relatives. Those would be the families Mustelidae, badgers, weasels, otters, and such, and Procyonidae, raccoons, coatis, kinkajous, and the like. In other words, two rad groups, both of which are more closely related to pandas than are bears, and which may, themselves, turn out to be the hagfish of pandas, depending on how the phylogeny shakes out in the end. But I don't know which group is cooler, so I'm just gonna start with the badgers, since I just dropped such a big badger bomb just a second ago, and it seems rude to leave you hanging. So the mustelids are the most speciose family of carnivorans with well over 50 species, maybe as many as 70. It includes things like otters, weasels, fishers, martens, not to mention a ton of things called badgers. You've got American badgers, honey badgers, hog badgers, Eurasian badgers, and ferret badgers, not to mention things like wolverines that look a lot like, well, badgers. The reality is that most of these badgers are the hagfish, lampreys, and cartilaginous fishes of mustelids. Many of them are more closely related to all of the other mustelids than they are to many or all of the other badgers. In fact, if I had to bet a nickel what the common ancestors of all mustelids looked like, I'd put some good money on them looking like badgers. And if you're gonna salvage the name badger for more than one or two of these groups, it will be because you recognize that ferrets and weasels are just mini slinky badgers, and otters are just swim badgers. You would pretty much need to call the whole group badgers, and frankly, I'd be fine with that. I mean, if you think that any of the members of this group are not hardcore enough to be called badgers, then you must only be familiar with domesticated ferrets, the lamest weasels, because this group is hardcore top to bottom. Just watch a stoat hunt and tell me that it isn't cool enough to be called a badger. I definitely need to make a whole video about all of the badgers, which does not include the stink badgers, but it does include several African varieties that look like skunks and spray stinky fluids from their anal glands. Something this group can do, except for the sea otters, which is why skunks were once thought to be part of the Mustelidae. So skunks are related to false badgers, and false skunks are badgers, and giant pandas aren't just black and white pandas, but false badgers might be. And that gets us to the final carnivoran family. The closest relatives to the badgers, great and small, the family Procyonidae, which despite only containing 12 species, is shockingly diverse. I mean, it includes raccoons, which seem familiar until you learn that there are 3 different species of raccoons. But it also includes ringtails and cacomissals, which, despite being the closest relatives of raccoons, I think it'd be easy to mistake them for civets. So some of them look like feliforms. And then there are the olingos, which also look somewhat like feliforms. You'd probably need to know something about auditory bullae to know that they aren't. To be perfectly honest, they even look a bit like marsupials to me. And being from South America, the ancestral home of marsupials, you would really need to know your stuff to not make that mistake. But interestingly, they maybe are not the weirdest member of the group. It includes coatis, which were probably the first animals I knew to be closely related to raccoons. But it also includes this, the kinkajou, which has to be one of the craziest of all terrestrial mammals. Well, arboreal mammals. If it weren't for the claws, I'd think it was a primate. A cursory glance at its skull would tell me it's a cat. One look at its skeleton would totally convince me that it has to be a cat-monkey hybrid. I mean, look at the prehensile tail. Within their range, they're commonly called mico-leon, lion monkeys. Common names in English include honey bear and night ape, despite its huge prehensile tail. No wonder people don't believe me when I say that gorillas are monkeys. But of course, by now, you know exactly why gorillas are monkeys, why kinkajous aren't primates, and why pronghorn aren't antelopes. But you don't yet know why golden moles aren't moles, why tenrecs aren't hedgehogs, or why elephant shrews are more closely related to elephants than they are to shrews. Because we haven't yet discussed the wonderful and outrageous clade Afrotheria. But that time is finally here. As it turns out, the placentalia has two clades. So far, we have explored only one of them. All of the rest of the mammals fall into the other, the Atlantogenata, which itself contains two of my favorite mammal clades, the Afrotheria and the Xenarthra. And I think we'll begin with the Afrotheria. I just think you've waited long enough. Let's start with why this group is so diverse, weird, and why its members so often look like things that they are not. It all starts with the extinction of the dinosaurs. We discussed this a bit last Dinosaur December. Well, it turns out that when the dinosaurs went extinct, Africa was an island. And it stayed that way until about 20 million years ago when it crashed into Eurasia. I would say that this is when the war with Eurasia began, but I think we all know that we have always been at war with Eurasia. But the reality is that for 45 million years, immediately following the greatest extinction event in the last 200 million years, Africa was all by itself. 75% of species on Earth had gone extinct. The dinosaurs, save one single group, were gone. And the world was full of niches that were wide open. Now, being an island, much like Australia, those niches were most likely to be filled by whatever was there. Yes, colonization events can and do occur, but not nearly as often as would be the case if animals could just walk over. Well, it turns out that groups like Eulipotyphla, shrews, moles, hedgehogs, and the like, glires, the rodents and lagomorphs like rabbits and pikas, carnivora, like dogs, cats, and otters, Xenarthra, armadillos, sloths, and anteaters, and the ungulates, basically all of your large herbivorous mammals, as well as the whales, were all absent from the African island continent. And that means that all of the niches occupied in other areas by the groups we just mentioned, if they were going to be filled by something, would all be filled, well, by something else. In Australia, many of those niches were filled by marsupials. In Africa, many of those niches were filled by members of the Afrotheria. Though, obviously, some are now filled by some of the aforementioned absent groups starting 20 million years ago when Eurasia and Africa came together. Of course, we all know that we have always been in an alliance with Eurasia. Always. But the take-home is that Afrotheria is made up of a lot of very diverse organisms that are strikingly similar in basic body plan, not so much to the other members of the Afrotheria, but rather to other groups that were not present in Africa until recently, if at all. This is called convergent evolution. Organisms that become similar, not because of similar ancestry, but rather because they are occupying a similar niche. Now, the Afrotheria is broken up into two major clades, the Afroinsectophilia and the Painungulata. Now, the reality is that I really want to talk about elephants. There are 3 extant species and one more that could be back very soon. But I want to save them for later because the Afroinsectophilia is a positively crazy group and I need to know more about it. And don't worry, I won't forget about the elephants. They say that elephants never forget, and I never forget about elephants. Anyway, I promised you that Afroinsectophilia is a crazy group, and it is. In fact, before we started using molecular analysis to generate phylogenies, we thought that pretty much all of these groups belonged to other groups. Remember earlier when we talked about convergent evolution? Well, perhaps the greatest benefit to using molecular evidence to generate phylogenies is that the molecular evidence is not nearly as biased by traits that are conspicuous to us, and that might be the result of convergent evolution instead of shared ancestry. Take, for example, the aardvark. Aardvarks of the family Oricteropodidae are the only surviving family within the order Tubulidentata. They are the most distantly related members of the Afroinsectophilia. But as we get deeper into the Afroinsectophilia, you will probably notice that they have no conspicuous similarities with the other members of the clade. Honestly, it resembles more closely the anteaters of the Americas. Now, is this resemblance because they share a recent common ancestor with anteaters? Or is it an artifact of the fact that they both eat ants, and the features that are most beneficial for ant-eating are likely to have been favored in both groups? And are they really that similar? Or is my attention disproportionately focused on their weird ant-eating adaptations because those are the things that most distinguish them from the other mammals? These would be difficult questions to answer if it weren't for molecular phylogenetics. And that is why today we think that aardvarks are not anteaters, but Afrotherians. And you're unlikely to confuse an aardvark with any other Afrotherian. You could confuse them with other similarly sized consumers of eusocial arthropods, such as echidnas, pangolins, numbats, armadillos, and anteaters. But most of that can be remedied by just noticing that aardvarks don't have spikes, scale-like plates, or armor, and they live in Africa. Really, they look like a pig, an opossum, and an armadillo had a baby, but it still wound up somewhat cute. They have sparse, coarse hair, heavily arched backs, a long rostrum with a flat, pig-like nose, and big, cute ears. They look almost nothing like Arthur. I don't know when the creators of Arthur decided that Arthur the aardvark would look better if he looked nothing like an aardvark. I'd say he looks like a Patagonian Mara, which would explain not only his face, but his lack of a tail sticking out of his pants. Anyway, if you see a pig possadillo crawl out from a hole in Africa, it's an aardvark. The next most distant relative to the other members of the Afroinsectophilia would be the elephant shrews of the family Macroscellidae, which are, as we already mentioned, surprisingly more closely related to elephants than they are to shrews. Which is like finding out through molecular analysis that catfish are more closely related to cats than fish. Or that a banana spider is more closely related to curvy yellow fruit than it is to spiders. It's just bananas. But the reality is that we called elephant shrews because we were so sure that they were shrews, and we were just being cheeky about the elephant part because of their silly wiggly noses. Well, it turned out that we were all wrong about them being shrews. Convergence again, but we were shockingly right about the elephant part, which is also likely convergence, but what a serendipitous convergence indeed. Now, shrews look a lot like mice or other small rodents, but with generally small eyes and pointy teeth instead of the continuously growing yellow incisors of rodents. Elephant shrews can be distinguished from true shrews by their wiggly elephant noses and, in many cases, larger, more mouse-like eyes. The next most distantly related family within the Afroinsectophilia are the golden moles of the family Chrysochloridae, which, as we said earlier, aren't moles. So far we have an anteater that isn't an anteater, a shrew that isn't a shrew, and now a mole that isn't a mole. I love this group. Again, golden moles are more closely related to elephants than they are to the animals they most closely resemble. And honestly, even more than they resemble moles, they resemble Australia's answer to the mole, the marsupial mole, which is even more distantly related to moles than are the golden moles. Honestly, the only mammals less related to moles or golden moles than marsupial moles are the egg-laying monotremes, the echidnas and platypuses. So the similarities between golden moles, and even more so between golden moles and marsupial moles, are pure convergences. Convergences to living like the underminer.
I'm always beneath you, but nothing is beneath me!
They even have some amazing convergences with the amphisbaenians, the worm and mole lizards. Mostly that they can detect seismic activity and have crazy digging forelimbs. But I can tell you with some confidence that mole lizards are not closely related to golden moles, though mole lizards are lizards. We've got a whole video ranting about that. Like true moles and marsupial moles, golden moles have short, powerful digging legs and eyes covered with skin, tiny ear openings, dense fur, and tough skin. Unlike true moles, they only have a couple of functional fingers on their forelimbs. They also have a cloaca, like a marsupial or a monotreme, and both of these oddities are shared with the marsupial moles. The big difference is that Well, golden moles are not marsupials, they're eutherian mammals, and thus they don't have a pouch. And they also have 3 forearm bones, unlike the 2 possessed by, well, almost every other mammal, and almost every other amniote for that matter. And they live in Africa instead of Australia. If you would like to see a video about the marsupial moles and all of the other marsupials, perhaps the greatest rival to the Afrotheria for diversity and weirdness within the mammals, let me know in the comments. You know, if you're into that kind of thing. But the 2 most closely related families in the Afroinsectophilia are the tenrecs of the family Tenrecidae and the otter shrews of the family Potamogalidae. Afroinsectophilia is obviously full of mammals that have filled the niches in Africa that are filled by various different groups of mammals everywhere else on Earth. And as we've already explained, this is because Africa was an island. Well, it turns out that Africa has its own island that has been separated from the rest of Africa for the last 150 million years, which is almost as long as mammals have existed. That island is called Madagascar, and it is primarily occupied by mammals found there and nowhere else. And it appears that their ancestors came principally by raft from the giant island continent just to the west, Africa. This would include the ancestors of the tenrecs. And just like the Afrotheria has since occupied numerous niches in Africa, generally occupied by other mammal groups, the same has happened in Madagascar with just the tenrecs. So there are tenrecs that look like hedgehogs, but aren't. Others that look like opossums, but they're not. Some that look like rodents, such as mice and rats. They ain't. There are tenrecs that look like shrews, but they're more closely related to elephant shrews and even elephants than they are to shrews. Like the golden moles and marsupials, to which they are not closely related, they have a cloaca. And that will help you tell them apart from the introduced shrews in Madagascar, as well as any rodents. Basically, if you see a little ground mammal in Madagascar with a long face, pointy teeth, small eyes, and no scrotum, even though it's a male, probably a tenrec. The most Afrotherian members of the Afrotheria. But not the last member of the Afroinsectophilia, because we haven't talked enough about their closest relatives, the Afrotheria as heckly named otter shrews of the family Potamogalidae. Afrotheria as heck because they are not otters, they're not shrews, and they're not closely related to either one of those things. That's Afrotheria as heck. But they do look like otter shrews. Not the kind of otter shrew that some unlikely Dr. Wu breeding project might create, but more like what you would get if you asked a 9-year-old that knew what shrews and otters looked like to draw an otter shrew. It's basically an otter with a shrew head. And then of course that 9-year-old would have it swim with its laterally compressed tail side to side like a crocodile, because most 9-year-olds don't know that mammals move up and down and generally continue to do so even when they return to the water. Watch our video on whales if you want to know more about that. So it's a crocodile-tailed otter with a shrew's head and a cloaca. Possibly because otter shrews are closely related to tenrecs and golden moles, and possibly because most 9-year-olds don't draw animals with their scrotums hanging out. And that brings us to the other clade within the Afrotheria, the pain ungulata. Ask me if this means that we're done with mammals that aren't what they seem. Nope. It's just more mammals that seem like things that they're not. And then also elephants. We won't forget about the elephants. This is not an elephant, but it is the closest relative to an elephant that can be found alive today on land. This is a hyrax of the family Procaviidae. But it really doesn't look like an elephant. Not at first glance, anyway. It looks like a large rodent or a lagomorph, but it isn't. For one thing, it doesn't have incisors like a rodent or a lagomorph. That isn't to say that they don't have incisors. They do. And it doesn't mean that they don't grow continuously through their lives. They do. But they don't use them to clip vegetation like rodents and lagomorphs. They're tusks. Incisor tusks. In mammals, tusks are almost always enlarged canine teeth, but not in hyraxes, and not in elephants either. Also, look at their toes. See those big rounded toenails? Those aren't the toes of a rodent. Where have you seen toes like that before? Oh, they also keep their testes inside, as do elephants, and also their closest relatives, which are not found on land. These would be two of my favorite mammal families, the Trichechidae and the Dugongidae. The latter of which I thought was extinct until they showed up on an episode of Crocodile Hunter one day. I was pleasantly surprised. And I'll get to them in a minute, but I want to talk about their closest relatives first. The elephants. 3 extant species, and one more that is supposed to make a return in 2027. So I'll include them too, just so this video stays evergreen. Now, all 4 fall into the family Elephantidae, and they can be distinguished from anything else by the fact that they're elephants. But in case you've lived your entire life in a hole somewhere, like a golden mole, or you come from outer space, elephants are generally very large. Insular dwarfism has resulted in pygmy elephants in the past, but currently the 4 species of elephants alive, or soon to be alive, are the 4 largest land animals on the planet. As mentioned earlier, they have tusks formed from their incisor teeth, not the canines. And their testes are internal, not held outside in a scrotum, which, if you think about it, is a much safer place to keep your testes. But the body cavity of most mammals is a bit toasty for spermatogenesis, so most mammals have to keep their testes out where it's cooler. Elephants, however, like hyraxes, keep their testes safely inside up by their kidneys.
That's a comfort. I was lucky that thing had knees.
That was not his knee. Not everybody keeps their genitals in the same place, Captain.
They also have hyrax-like toes and feet that are digitigrade, in that they stand on their toes, but in the case of the elephants, they are functionally plantigrade, as the back of the foot transfers weight up to the heel, and so despite standing on their toes, they do not put all of their weight on their toes. They do tend to be heavy, you know. Oh, and they have giant prehensile noses. That alone sets them apart from anything else on Earth. There are 2 African species in the genus Loxodonta. The African bush elephant, the largest land animal on the planet, and the smaller but still huge African forest elephant. African elephants can be distinguished by the fact that they are in Africa, as well as their comparatively large ears. There are also 2 species of extant, or soon to be extant, elephants outside of Africa, the Asian elephant and the woolly mammoth. They can be distinguished by the fact that their ears are smaller, their trunks have a single finger-like projection at the end as opposed to the 2 opposing projections of the African elephants. Asian elephants also have double crowns to their heads versus the single crown of the African elephants, and woolly mammoths are woolly as can be. The closest relatives to the elephants are the last 2 families of extant Afrotherians. And they are the groups that have gotten the farthest away from Africa because they can swim. These 2 families are the manatees of the family Trichechidae and their closest relatives, the dugongs of the family Dugongidae. Now, I knew of the giant dugong, the Steller sea cow, since I was a small child. But I also knew, to my devastation, that it was hunted to extinction by 1768, just 27 years after its discovery. And then, one day while watching the Crocodile Hunter, to my great joy, there was one. Or at least a tiny version of one. A dugong. Alive. Manatees and dugongs, especially dugongs, look like whales. But, of course, they aren't, because they're proud Afrotherians. But they do look like something between a whale and the world's ugliest mermaids. And rumor has it that they were the source of the mermaid legends. But man, You'd have to be on a boat for a very long time. To me, they look a bit like walruses, but they can easily be distinguished by their tails, which are more like a whale tail than the back legs of a pinniped. Manatees tend to be more portly in build and have rounded tails. Dugongs, on the other hand, are more lean and fast with more whale-like tails. In both cases, they swim up and down like the whales they pretend to be, and not like their cousins, the otter shrews. And that brings us to the end of the Afrotheria, and to the final clade of mammals alive today. But we might have saved the best for last, because we're discussing what just might be the most delightful and wonderful clade of extant mammals, the Xenarthra, a group that originated in South America about 60 million years ago, and has been filling me with joy ever since. The word Xenarthra means strange or alien joint in reference to the absolutely unique spinal morphology of the group that results in additional rigidity and control over the lower regions of the vertebral column, specifically the sacral and lumbar regions. This spinal articulation is so unusual and so absolutely unique to this group that it is simply called Xenarthri. But Xenarthri is not the only unusual feature of the Xenarthran vertebral column, because they also have an attribute more often seen in dinosaurs, a fusion of many of the bones in the pelvis to the vertebrae of the pelvis, a structure called a synsacrum, which also gives them more spinal rigidity. But that isn't the only way that they're unique. Their limbs are extremely strong with very thick bones for an animal their size and large processes for muscle attachment. They also have unique teeth, and they have only one type of cone cell in their eyes, so they likely only see one color. And this will shock you, but sloths and their relatives have the slowest metabolisms of any eutherian mammals. But what are their closest relatives? Well, their most distant cousins within the Xenarthra are these, the armadillos of the order Cingulata. How wonderful is that? And armadillos, just for the record, include these, which are actually more closely related to some extant armadillos than those armadillos are to the other extant armadillos, even though they weighed more than 2 tons. Not the largest of the Xenarthra, but a dang big armadillo. And I love armadillos. The bigger the better, which isn't to say that the pink fairy armadillo isn't wonderful. I just love armadillos. Cingulata means girdled for reasons that are pretty obvious if you've ever seen an armadillo. They are famously girdled and armored. Today they range in size from the tiny pink fairy armadillo that only weighs about 120 grams or about a quarter pound, about as much as a hamburger patty, to the giant armadillo, which can weigh as much as 54 kilos, which is almost 120 pounds. That's the same as a Great Dane, though they're generally more lab-sized. And I mentioned that there once were truly gigantic armadillos. Not just bigger than most dogs, but bigger than most cars. And if I'd made this video just 12,000 years ago, I would have been talking about them as still being around. But even though they're gone, I still want to talk about them just for a second. I mean, this is probably the closest thing the mammals have ever produced to an ankylosaur, and those are my favorite ornithischian dinosaurs. Armadillos in general are well known for their armor and ability to roll up more or less into a ball. Well, these guys, the Glyptodonts, were extraordinarily well armored, with a solid, ungirdled, shell-like carapace made, like all armadillos, of thick, bony osteoderms. It was ungirdled because Glyptodonts were extra bought into the rigid spine life and had totally fused spines. Their shell was more like that of a turtle in this way than it was like that of most armadillos. Being unable to roll into a ball to protect their undersides, they had osteoderms there as well. So they had an immobile spine, an immobile shell, and an armored belly, all like turtles. But the main reason that I say they were more like ankylosaurs than they were like 5-foot-tall mammal turtles is because many had not only long armored tails, but tails with big clubs at the end, which they used by all appearances primarily to fight with one another, like ankylosaurs. They also had armored heads, as is common in armadillos, but also ankylosaurs. So if a turtle and an ankylosaur had a baby, and that baby was a mammal, this is totally what you'd get. And the Glyptodonts appear to have been the largest members of the still extant armadillo family, Clemiphoridae, at least based on the genetic analysis that we've been able to conduct. Because remember, these guys haven't been gone too long. We have their genetic material. which also means that it isn't so far-fetched that we could bring them back one day, which would make me unspeakably happy. I would rather see a glyptodon than a mammoth. Today, the family Clemaphoridae, meaning cloak-wearing, in reference to the cloak-like appearance of their armored carapace, contains roughly 14 species, including the 2 that we discussed earlier. As xenarthrans, they are unsurprisingly widespread in South America, east of the Andes. But where the herbivorous glyptodons did make good headway in North America after the 2 continents became connected, the insectivorous or omnivorous extant members of the family just barely touch North America at the southernmost tip of Mexico. If you've seen a wild armadillo north of that point, it was likely one of the 7 or so species in the other extant armadillo family, the family Decipodidae, the hairy-footed armadillos, with all extant species belonging to the genus Dasypus, the long-nosed armadillos, which are, in addition to North America, quite well represented in South America. Which means that you need to know the difference between the 2 families, at least if you're going to be looking for armadillos anywhere south of Mexico. Like many of their cousins, members of the genus Dasypus are primarily insectivorous or omnivorous. They tend to have more bands than their cousins, with 6 to 11 total, though some clemaphorids have many bands as well. No extant Dasypodids can roll into a complete ball like some of the clemaphorids can, but again, not all of the clemaphorids can either. And this isn't something that you can see, but members of the genus Dasypus have a unique form of reproduction. Not just unique from their closest relatives, but unique for mammals. They produce 1 zygote, and then it splits into 4 genetically identical embryos, resulting in identical quadruplets every time. Monozygotic polyembryony, which is too rad not to bring up, even if it would be hard to use to distinguish them from their cousins. I really don't know why these are the hairy-footed armadillos, because while some are hairy, I would say as a group, the clemaphorids have hairier undersides and feet. But long-nosed is not bad. Most armadillos have somewhat long noses, but the heads of Dasypus armadillos do tend to be longer and thinner than those of their cousins. So this is probably the best way to distinguish them. Some of you may know a better way, and I will almost certainly do a video covering every armadillo species at some point in the not-so-distant future, so if you know a better way, please let me know. I just love them so much. But right now, I want to talk about a different group of long-nosed, digging sloth relatives. Relatives that are even more closely related to sloths than are the armadillos, but that I might love just as much. So armadillos were in the order Cingulata, the girdled xenarthrans. And all those that remain are in the order Pilosa, the hairy xenarthrans. Which I would guess makes sense. Armadillos, even the hairiest armadillos, are the least hairy members of the clade. And the closest relatives of sloths are these, the unspeakably wonderful members of the suborder Vermilingua, the anteaters. Vermilingua means worm tongue, by the way.
Gandalf the Grey is coming.
And other than alligator snapping turtles, I can't think of any group of animals that deserves the name more. I mean, look at that tongue! Though I will acknowledge that there are some other insect-eating animals like aardvarks, numbats, and echidnas that have somewhat similar tongues. Aardvarks, in fact, being members of the Afrotheria, are among the closest relatives of the Xenarthra. However, numbats, being marsupials, are among the least closely related mammals to the true worm tongues. Only echidnas, and other monotremes, are less closely related. And odds are that if you are fairly into animals, you are familiar with the giant anteater. But I will tell you, I was pretty old before I knew where these came from. I think if you would have asked me, I probably would have guessed Africa, like their not-so-distant Afrotherian cousins, the aardvarks. But by now, you probably know enough about Xenarthra to know that Africa is probably not where these are from. There is probably a reason that they have a cousin in the African clade that is filling approximately the same role. Because Xenarthra is a South American clade, and that is where the true anteaters are found. Though they have made their way also into southern Mexico, so they do get as far as North America. And I will tell you that for much of my life, the giant anteater was the only anteater I knew about. But it turns out that they are not the only members of their family. There are 3 species. And the family Myrmecophagidae, which literally means anteaters, is not the only family of worm tongues, because there is a second family. So there's the giant anteater in the family Myrmecophagidae, as well as 2 species of arboreal anteaters called tamanduas, which I've adored since I first learned that they existed. Though you would need to watch out how you express your affection for anteaters. They are xenarthrans, so their arms are abnormally powerful. And those huge claws that they generally use for tearing into insect nests and climbing trees are no joke. They may have no teeth or any ability to bite, but they can mess you up. When a tamandua stands up like this, it isn't just adorable as can be. It's a legitimate threat. Plus, they can release a powerful musk. But it would be very difficult not to want to hug it. I love them. But there is another family with only one extant species. The family Cyclopedidae, which is about the most Jim Henson thing we've seen since the Potus. I mean, why is this real? Cyclopedidae means circle feet, apparently because they can nearly fully encircle a branch when climbing. The only extant species, the silky anteater, would probably struggle if the branch is very large, though. It is the smallest of the 4 anteater species. It's the size of a squirrel. Giant anteaters can be over 2 meters long and weigh as much as a giant armadillo, the extant variety. You would never confuse a silky anteater for any of its cousins, but it does look like the baby of a tamandua and a proboscis monkey. These guys have much shorter but proportionally wider heads than their cousins, and even smaller ear pinnae than those of their much larger cousins. But that same tongue, and 2 powerful digging and climbing claws on the front feet, as well as the prehensile tail of its tamandua parent, as old world monkeys don't have prehensile tails. But looking at the way that this animal moves, and those 2-toed feet, it's probably starting to be a bit less shocking that anteaters and sloths might not be that distantly related after all. Now today, there are 6 species of sloths in 2 families within the suborder of sloths, Folivora, the leaf eaters. But before we get to the extant members of the Folivora, I want to talk for just a moment about giant ground sloths. Because the similarities between the arboreal anteaters and the arboreal sloths are more likely due to convergence than shared ancestry. This is even true if you're just discussing the 2 families of arboreal sloths found today, because the earliest sloths, from all indications, were not arboreal at all. And while sloths today are found only where you would most expect to find xenarthrans, in South America and parts of Central America, ancient ground sloths made it far into North America. And giant sloths only went extinct at about the same time as the mammalian ankylosaurs. So there is some room for optimism that we could one day see them again. And if there's one thing that could be as exciting as seeing a glyptodont in the flesh, it might be seeing a megatherium. I mean, some of them were 6 meters long and weighed more than 4 tons. Of course, may not have even been the largest sloth, because other sloths, like Lestodon, were also around that size. You know, the size of an Asian elephant. And here's the thing. The earliest sloths were large and terrestrial. And those 2 giants were not one another's closest relatives. In fact, Megatherium was more closely related to a 3-toed sloth than it was to Lestodon. And Lestodon was more closely related to a 2-toed sloth than to Megatherium. And 2-toed sloths and 3-toed sloths are both more closely related to a host of giant land sloths than they are to one another. It's just that when all of the land sloth lineages came to an end, the 2 arboreal sloth families were all that remained. And it is remarkable how similarly the 2 lineages turned out. And I'm almost ready to talk about them, but I do have to tell you that we are going to need a video just about ancient sloths, because sloths started down the whale path as well. Yeah, there were marine sloths. And while we're on the subject of false whales, Afrotheria, the closest relatives of Xenarthra, has its own false whales, manatees and dugongs. And while dugongs have 7 neck vertebrae just like all other mammals, manatees are super strange for having only 6. The only other mammals with a number different than 7 are the 2 families of not giraffes, but tree sloths. But the crazy thing, at least if you don't realize that these 2 families are not closely related, is that the numbers, while both different from 7, are different from one another too. 2-toed sloths, called 2-toed sloths because they, like silky anteaters, have only 2 clawed toes on their front legs, have somewhere between 5 and 7. Whereas 3-toed sloths, called 3-toed sloths because they have 3 clawed toes on their front legs, have 8 to 10 neck or cervical vertebrae. There are today 5 species of 3-toed sloths in the family Bradypotidae. the slow-footed sloths, which is a heck of a burn if you think about it. As you would probably expect by now, they are found in South America, but are limited to the more heavily forested regions of northern South America into Central America. In addition to a different number of toes and cervical vertebrae, three-toed sloths can also be identified by their faces, which are altogether different in shape from their distant two-toed cousins, and generally sport a dark eye stripe, like that of my favorite snake, the false water cobra, which is found in many of the same places as three-toed sloths. Additionally, unlike their dual-digited doppelgangers, they have a tail that is long enough to be visible through their fur. And they're smaller than two-toed sloths, with the largest being only a touch over 6 kilos, less than 14 pounds, and about 80 centimeters long, or about 31 inches. And while these guys aren't inescapably Muppets, I'm pretty sure they get the Jim Henson seal of approval. Of course, that is something that three-toed sloths have in common with their closest extant but actually rather distant cousins, the two species of two-toed sloths in the family Colopodidae. And I should add that if you're going to call a group of sloths out for being slow-footed, you better have something equally demeaning for the other group of basically equally slow-footed sloths. And good news, Colopodidae means lame-footed. Touché. The range of these lame-footed sloths largely overlaps that of their slow-footed cousins, but does not go quite as far south. So despite being the larger of the two micro-tree sloths, they have the smaller range. They are larger by mass, though, getting to around 11 kilos or a touch under 24 pounds and nearly 90 centimeters long, though the largest slow feet are larger than the smallest lame feet. So size is probably not the best way to tell them apart. I would say that the toes and the face are the best indicators. Two-toed sloths lack the eye stripe of their triple-toed pseudo-twins. So if you can see their faces, it really isn't very difficult to tell them apart. And just like that, we have made it to the end of our tour of the Mammalia. Every single family alive today. Thank you for joining us on this adventure. We hope that you've enjoyed this journey and learned some things you never knew before. As always, like and subscribe. We hope to see you real soon. I just want to thank all of these people who made this incredible endeavor possible. We never could have done it without them. Thank you for your support. And if you'd like to join them to help us create more content like this, or just to see the awesome features that we have for our patrons, please consider checking it out.